ahead and modernizing theirs. For example, China boasts more than 15,000 miles of high-speed rails with top speeds over 155 miles per hour. Meanwhile, the fastest train in the United States has an average speed of 82 miles an hour. We are both figuratively and literally failing to keep pace with our global competitors. Everyone wins when we make meaningful, sustained investments in the nation's infrastructure. Infrastructure development creates thousands of good-paying jobs for hardworking Americans. From civil engineers and hydrologists to truck drivers and rail car repairers, infrastructure investment offers workers a wide range of skills and education levels and those opportunities that come with it to earn competitive wages. Infrastructure investment is also a win for American business. Our transport systems are the backbone of our economy. When we invest in infrastructure, it results in a significant economic multiplier. With each dollar spent, our nation becomes more competitive and indeed more prosperous. What is good for the nation as a whole is good for our local communities. We must continue to reinvest and revitalize our urban neighborhoods and rural communities through successful programs like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit and the New Markets Tax Credit. I certainly have been a longtime supporter of both of these initiatives because they have real positive effects on our communities. The President campaigned on a massive infrastructure package, and he mentioned it again this year in his State of the Union address. I have spoken personally and met with Secretary Mnuchin and Secretary Chao, and both have assured me that we have willing partners in the administration. So I think we have a real opportunity here to work together and do something really big. And with that, let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Brady, for his opening statement.
Chairman, thank you for convening this hearing today. While too much time in Congress is being wasted in a rush to impeachment by the new House majority, there is more urgent work to be done on behalf of the American people, acting to address our nation's infrastructure. This is crucial for my state of Texas, where we are experiencing strong economic growth, nearly 500,000 new residents a year moving in, and increased cargo from our growing trade relationship with Mexico and other trading partners around the globe. It's also crucial for America, which thanks to our new modern tax code is enjoying economic growth today nearly 50% higher than projected just 2 years ago. Record low unemployment, the highest paycheck growth in more than a decade, especially for low and moderate income workers, and more job openings than unemployed. U.S. manufacturing is back, experiencing its best year in decades. And all this growth translates into a greater need for more roads, modern ports, expanded rail and waterways, more pipelines to carry affordable energy to communities, the latest telecommunications infrastructure into every rural and every low-income community, and smart technology to increase capacity and lower congestion. Stronger growth through better infrastructure is a priority that President Trump and lawmakers on both sides of the aisle share. We are eager to work together with our Democratic friends on this committee to send meaningful legislation to the President's desk this year. And as we begin this work, we should also recognize the challenges. Among them, the fact that our highway infrastructure program is too often a leaky bucket, with nearly 20% of funding diverted to non-highway uses, and all while vital projects are often delayed for years by mind-numbing state, local, and federal red tape that drives up costs and increases congestion. It's important that as we explore ways to find revenue to fill the infrastructure bucket, we take concrete steps together to fill these leaks so more money goes directly to the projects our communities and states desperately need. That means doing more to cut bureaucratic red tape and permitting delays while removing unnecessary, costly regulations at all levels of government and across agencies. We are ready to sit down and roll up our sleeves to find common ground on rethinking the process and responsibly accelerating infrastructure projects. That includes encouraging the use of technology and innovative solutions. We cannot overlook the role of the private sector in a 21st century infrastructure system. As we've seen in nearly every industry, from technology to healthcare, the ingenuity and imagination of the private sector will always lead to better, more affordable, and more reliable products. I'm also convinced that we can redesign our infrastructure system to attract far more private capital to help us address our infrastructure needs, to augment, not to replace. And for a nation that prizes free enterprise, we fall woefully behind other nations in attracting non-government investment for our growing infrastructure needs. I must caution it would be a mistake to fund infrastructure by raising taxes on local businesses and corporations, making them uncompetitive in the global market. Any effort to slow down wage growth for workers and take our economy backwards by putting local companies at a disadvantage in this global economy doesn't make economic sense and will be opposed. And as we promote and seek the advances of new technologies and innovations, we must not simply throw money from DC's coffers and praise it sticks somewhere. This year we note the 10th anniversary of the 2009 stimulus bill, which I think we all acknowledge fails to address America's infrastructure. Whether a supporter or a strong critic, let's learn from its lessons by ensuring we don't waste taxpayer dollars by rushing into projects without sufficient consideration for their efficiency and value. In closing, improving our nation's infrastructure is a priority we all share. I'm optimistic that we can reach a bipartisan consensus on how best to accomplish this. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today their ideas as well. Thank you, Chairman Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. You're invited to continue if you'd like while we wait for the two witnesses. So we'll just take a bit of a temporary timeout because I understand if there was better infrastructure, they'd be here faster. Outgoing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We will now reconvene. We have two witness panels today, and we will begin with our member panel, and then we'll move to our panel of outside experts and industry representatives. On the first panel, I have the honor of welcoming two of our esteemed colleagues from the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. First, we'll hear from the Honorable Peter DeFazio, who is Chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and is the longest-serving House member in Oregon's history. He has been, I would note, by the way, he was born and raised in Massachusetts. He has been a champion on infrastructure issues throughout his career. We will then hear from the Honorable Sam Graves, who is the ranking member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Mr. Graves represents the 6th District of Missouri, and as a small businessman and 6th-generation family farmer, he is personally familiar with the impact of infrastructure and its investment on business. With that, Mr. DeFazio, would you proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this long overdue hearing by the full committee on America's infrastructure needs and the possible provisions to pay for it. You know, Sam and I could write a great bill in terms of policy, but the bottom line is we need investment. Today, you know, if you look at federal spending, which we haven't increased gas tax since '93, basically we've cut federal spending by 20% in real terms. The Highway Trust Fund is running a $16 billion a year deficit in terms of the current revenues, so we're borrowing $16 billion a year to backfill the Highway Trust Fund. You know, that still is not an adequate investment according to the American Society of Civil Engineers over the next 10 years. We're going to be about $1 trillion short for surface transportation needs from all sources. So the needs are huge, $836 billion for unmet capital for highways and bridges. 50,000 bridges need substantial repair or replacement. 40% of the national highway system needs not just to be resurfaced, but to be rebuilt. And about $100 billion in terms of transit, and that's just to bring things up to a state of good repair. That's not to get to the point where we're mitigating congestion, giving people new transit alternatives in the urban areas. And the costs of doing nothing are astronomical. You know, a couple of examples, Brent Spence Bridge between Ohio and Kentucky. It's about a $3 billion project. It's going up by $100 million a year every year we delay, and the estimates are the current bridge won't be usable in 10 years. Then what do you do? We have the tunnels under the Hudson River, Gateway and the Portal Bridge. Those tunnels went near failure during Hurricane Sandy. If they fail, the costs to the economy are $100 million a day. And if you wanted to build 2 new tunnels on an emergency basis, maybe you can get done in 4 years. So you've now spent $140 billion of lost economic activity because you wouldn't invest in a $16 billion project. Business Roundtable says we lose $27 billion per year in extra transportation costs because of congestion and delays. For drivers, our people driving small vehicles, individual vehicles, they wasted 3.1 billion gallons of fuel stuck in traffic, and their annual repair bill due to disrepair for their cars runs an average of $1,400. As I said, we're shoring up the Highway Trust Fund now by borrowing, and over the next 10 years we'll be short $164 billion with current revenues just to maintain the status quo, which is inadequate. Now, there's some, you know, proposing P3s, private-public partnerships. I brought this report. I will email one to every member of the committee. This was a bipartisan select committee of transportation 5 years ago, which came to the conclusion that P3s, private-public partnerships, can address somewhere close to 10 to 12% of our needs because much of the system can't make money. So you cannot engage the private sector in doing those projects. Similarly, an infrastructure bank, which some would say will solve all the problems. We have private activity bonds, we have TIFIA loans. We could put more money into those programs. You could create an infrastructure bank, but that, again, is only going to lend itself to things that have revenue. Yeah, you can toll some of the bridges, but you know, there's no transit system in the world that makes money. Most of the highways we're talking about don't carry volumes that are adequate, even if you tolled them, and many of those bridges, same thing. So we need real federal investment. Others say, let's go to a VMT. Well, we're not ready to jump to a vehicle miles traveled. I would like to do a nationwide pilot program. My state is on its second pilot. There are a lot of issues with VMT, vehicle miles traveled. If you're going to do it fairly, you have to do it with real-time pricing, congestion pricing, because someone who drives 25 miles to the feed store in a rural area is not contributing to deterioration or congestion. Someone who jumps on 205 in Portland is. They shouldn't pay the same per mile fee, and there is a little bit of concern among people, particularly in my rural areas, about the government tracking their movements. So we've got to work our way through that, but if we do a nationwide pilot, and in 10 or 12 years, we will be ready to move there. I have proposed something very de minimis because people are afraid of the gas tax, although many states, way more than half the states now have raised their gas tax. No one's lost their election over it, and many of those are substantial increases. But I said, okay, well, anybody think you're going to lose your election if gas goes up 1.5 cents a gallon? I never get anybody to raise their hand. You want to raise your hand? Okay, no one here either. So I have Penny for Progress, index the gas and diesel tax, and then bond the projected income. You could issue bonds for 13 years in tranches of about $33 to $35 billion, fill in the hole in the trust fund, create another $17 billion a year for a needed backlogged spending. And sure, it creates a cliff out there a decade or so, but in a decade or so, we will have much higher penetration of electric vehicles, and we will need to move to vehicle miles traveled in order to have a system that's equitable. With that, Mr. Chairman, I hope that this committee will take substantial action to raise revenues. There is a provision in the current FAST Act. We could do nothing, and if you raise revenues, they will flow through the existing formulas. If the money was there today, the states would have the money tomorrow under existing formulas, and they would be contracting for this construction season. There are perhaps some changes we would like to make in some of the provisions in a short-term bill, but generally that's the bottom line. You put up the money, it'll get done.
We thank the gentleman for his institutional knowledge on these issues. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Graves, is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Neal, Ranking Member Brady, and the rest of the committee, for that matter. And I appreciate you holding this hearing to focus on how we're going to fund our infrastructure now and obviously in the future. I think we have a real opportunity to address the vital question, which is improving our infrastructure, creating jobs, and strengthening the economy. I think there's widespread agreement within the House, within the Senate, the White House, that we do need to act. We saw the President urging Congress to send him a bipartisan infrastructure piece of legislation that he can sign into law. And most importantly, I think all of our constituents want this as well. Chairman DeFazio and I are eager to do our part. Last month, our committee held its first hearing, and we heard from numerous stakeholders about our infrastructure needs. And the chairman and I have been talking about how we can move forward an infrastructure bill that we can be proud of. And we both stand ready, and as he pointed out, we could write a bill right now. We obviously, we can work with your committee. We have always had a very good working relationship with your committee in being able to do something like this. The federal government has long played a leading role in infrastructure investment, and we need to continue that role as we serve as a reliable partner to both state and our local governments. And today, as you consider how to ensure robust infrastructure investment, I want to outline some of my priorities and some of the challenges. In order to launch our infrastructure into the 21st century, I believe we need to do a better job of incorporating advancements in technology. If we can tap into this potential, technology can make our infrastructure much safer and much less costly and improve the efficiency of the network that we have. And furthermore, continuing to streamline the project delivery process is going to help ensure that we get the most out of our federal funding. It's going to expedite the necessary improvements that we need, and basically, and you all know this, that time is money. The biggest elephant in the room, as has been kind of pointed out, when it comes to surface transportation investment, is going to be fixing the Highway Trust Fund and ensuring that it's sustainable for the future. And as the chairman pointed out, I think all options are on the table. The fact is the Highway Trust Fund is going to continue to face shortfalls in the coming years, $16 billion annually, to give you just a little bit of a rough sense of things. While gas tax and diesel taxes have historically served as very efficient mechanisms for sustaining the trust fund, they simply aren't going to meet our future needs. And this situation is only going to get worse as cars, buses, and our truck fleet become more fuel efficient, and hybrids and obviously electric vehicles become more popular. To be frank, the gas tax is not a long-term solution. We have to decide to address the long-term solvency of the trust fund, and it's going to take significant political capital to accomplish our shared goal, and the same is true for the near-term fix as well. If we're going to spend that capital, that political capital, we've got to focus on the long term, in my opinion. And the most promising long-term solution is VMT, as has been mentioned. The VMT has the potential to be a true user-funded program that captures everyone and gets the Highway Trust Fund back to where it needs to be to maintain our network and improve it. Like any real solution, there are challenges with that. For instance, privacy is a big concern with many of our colleagues. And the question about whether or not VMT is fair to both rural and urban drivers has been raised. And answering these questions are important to getting buy-in on the VMT program, and I can assure you they are being addressed in a meaningful and quantifiable way by multiple states that are actively testing VMT. Most recently completed study in Washington State provided some very good insight into some of the commonly raised concerns that do include data showing that rural drivers are expected to fare better under VMT than under the gas tax. As has also been pointed out by the chairman, that we can come up with an adjustment for urban and rural drivers. That pilot also showed that in long-term VMT, it outperforms the state's 49-cent gas tax, which is the third highest in the nation. The fact is, pilot programs in multiple states are successfully exploring these and many other issues with VMT, including different collection mechanisms to guard a driver's privacy, and not everything has to be GPS, as some might assume. We aren't talking about tracking. We are talking about is doing something in a much simpler way. Taking the lessons being learned, we can put in place a national framework for VMT with the goal of providing that stable, truly long-term solution that we desperately need for the Highway Trust Fund. Solutions for the trust fund and our infrastructure will require building consensus and being good stewards, obviously, of the taxpayers' dollars. Our committees, again, as I pointed out earlier, we have a long history of working together, and I look forward to continuing that relationship to accomplish something great for the American people and the economy. As I mentioned, again, everything is on the table. We are open to whatever you all put forth. But again, if we're going to spend that political capital, and it's going to take political capital to try to get something done, my belief is that we go ahead and we do it now rather than doing something that we're going to have to come right back around and fix later, because we do have more and more efficient vehicles and more vehicles on the road that simply are not paying for the use of that road. And with that, I appreciate the opportunity for both of us to testify today and look forward to hearing from
Thank you, Ranking Member Graves. And out of respect for your schedules and consistent with past practice, we will not ask you to stay for questioning. I thank you both for appearing before us today, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record, and you have 5 days to make any adjustments. And with that, thank the two of you. We will now have our second panel, and I'll give them a moment to take their seats. For our second panel, we have assembled distinguished witnesses who view our infrastructure crisis from differing perspectives. First, I would like to welcome Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO. Mr. Trumka represents 12.5 million members advocating to ensure that all workers have a good job and the power to determine their wages and working conditions. Next is Tom Donohue, President and CEO of the United States Chamber of Commerce, having served in this position since 1997. Mr. Donohue has spearheaded the Chamber's efforts to rebuild America's infrastructure. Greg DiLoreto, who is President of the American Society of Civil Engineers and currently is the chair of their Committee for American Infrastructure. Chris Spear is President and CEO of the American Trucking Associations. Mr. Spear also serves on the Board of Directors for the American Transportation Research Institute, the Federal Advisory Committee on Autonomous Technology, and the Northwestern University Transportation Center and its Advisory Council and its Congressional Award Foundation. And then finally, Mr. Mark Scribner is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. His research focuses on transportation, land use, and urban growth policy issues. Each of your statements will be made part of the record in its entirety. I would ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less, and to help you with that time, there is a timing light on your table. When you have 1 minute left, the light will switch from green to yellow and then finally to red when the 5 minutes are up. Mr. Trumka, would you please proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Brady and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. As you noted, the AFL-CIO is America's labor federation, representing 55 affiliate unions and 12.5 million workers across the country. Let me start by saying that it's an honor to address you today. While an honor, it's also quite frustrating because despite widespread calls to act from business and labor and those who rely on our infrastructure every single day, after all the studies and reports outlining this urgent crisis, no meaningful action has been taken to correct decades of chronic underinvestment. So, Mr. Chairman, I do find it encouraging that you're holding this important hearing. The fact is, our nation used to pride itself on our ability to create a better, brighter, and more prosperous future by investing in our infrastructure. Our parents and grandparents didn't pass the buck. They rolled up their sleeves and they went to work. We can do that too. We can create millions of good jobs, increase long-term growth, maintain our position as leaders of the global economy, and improve working people's lives and livelihoods. The AFL-CIO and our affiliates have long supported a substantial long-term infrastructure investment plan. Today, I want to walk you through 4 key reasons why we keep doing our part to help Congress get there. First, infrastructure investments create good jobs and career paths that can support a family, a child's education, a secure retirement, and a middle-class life. To that end, infrastructure packages must maintain long-standing federal policies that support working people with high labor standards and good jobs. Second, infrastructure investment spurs economic growth. Studies have shown that for every $1 of infrastructure investment creates more than $3 in growth, making it one of the greatest economic multipliers at the federal government's disposal. New rail and transit terminals are often followed by housing and businesses that sprout up around them. These types of transportation investments help workers find employment opportunities that may have been previously inaccessible. Third, if we want to be a nation that continues leading the way in the global economy, we have to build modern, forward-looking infrastructure. We can't afford to fall further behind our foreign competitors. Above all else, infrastructure investment is a vital, long-term national necessity that will determine what kind of country we will be decades from now. And lastly, investing in infrastructure improves the quality of life for all working people. Take the simple act of commuting to work each day. The average driver now spends an extra 97 hours a year on the road due to congestion. Precious time that could have been spent with family, friends, or earning a few extra dollars. Lost time and wasted fuel is now costing commuters more than $1,300 a year while adding unnecessary emissions to our atmosphere. Plus, they endure, on average, $600 of damage to their car each year. The cost of inaction is being felt far and wide, and it poses significant risks to our country. Even projects of critical national security, national significance are being neglected. A couple of examples. The Gateway Tunnel, the existing 100-year tunnel that connects the entire Northeast region under the Hudson River, has been in need of expansion for 25 years. Every day, our members move 800,000 passengers through the labyrinth of outdated infrastructure. If you left to fail, it'll cost our economy $100 million a day. The Soo Locks in Michigan have only one functioning lock, built in 1896, that can handle modern vessels. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers calls it the Achilles heel of the industrial economy, which, if failed, would result in the economic loss of $1.1 trillion and 11 million jobs. The Highway Trust Fund is facing an urgent and dire funding cliff that needs immediate attention. The gas users fee, which funds the trust fund, has not kept pace and needs to be adjusted to meet current needs. Mr. Chairman, I know my time is up. I would just say that the people of America can't afford to wait any longer. We need to act. We need to act now.
Thank you, Mr. Trumka. With that, Mr. Donohue, would you proceed? Put your microphone on, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and others. You know, as Rich has just said, we've been here before, and we're going to keep coming. We're determined to get this done, and in our judgment, it can only be done in a bipartisan way. In that spirit, I urge the members of this committee to find a common cause on this national priority, just as business and labor have. The stakes are high for all of us. Our long-term competitiveness and lasting prosperity is critical, and the businesses that the U.S. Chamber represented depend on it and are willing to support a vigorous program. Just today, we released our quarterly Small Business Index, which found that crumbling infrastructure is a significant roadblock standing in the way of American small business. A majority of the respondents told us that highways and local roads and bridges are critical to their success, and 62% said that the local surface infrastructure is average at best, poor or very bad quality in most places. The Chamber has outlined a four-part plan that addresses the essentials: how to get projects approved in a timely manner, who does the work, and how to pay for it. Dedicated funding systems, trust funds, federal loans and grants, and private resources should all be leveraged to upgrade core infrastructure. There's $100 billion in private global capital that we know is available to be a part of this effort, and we have to find ways to motivate it and get it there. My written testimony discusses all of these ideas. For the balance of my time, though, I'd like to talk about the elephant in the room. I want to talk about a gas tax. The federal gas tax, which funds highway and transit programs, is a flat 18.4 cents, the same as it was in 1993. How many people in this room can live off the same paycheck they had in 1993? No one. Our nation's roads and bridges and transit systems can't either. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that $150 billion in additional revenue is necessary just to carry on the program until 2025 that's in place. That's why the Chamber advocates raising the gas tax by 25 cents, which would generate just about $400 billion over the next 10 years, which would give us some of the money we need to do roads, bridges, and transit. Understand that much of this increase would be paid by business. Truckers, for example, who will speak for themselves, would bear a large portion of this cost. They're already being taking care of these costs on the infrastructure side and will do more. This is a well-understood question outside Washington. That's why I'm glad you're getting so many people to talk about that. And I've always said the Chamber is open to any ideas that'll help us get there, and we both believe that. We're even hosting a competition at the Chamber for new deals, new ideas on how to fund this, and we're paying for it. The Chamber members pay the cost of this inaction. We are ready to step up and do what's needed, and I ask your support in going forward on this before, and as Rich said and others will say, we go so much further that the bridge to where we need to go is so big and so long that we won't be able to afford it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Donohue. With that, let me recognize Mr. DiLoretto to begin his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Neal, Ranking Member Brady, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the need to invest in America's infrastructure. I'm Greg DiLoretto. I'm the past president and the current chair of ASC's Committee on America's Infrastructure, and I'm a retired chief executive of a large water utility and a former city engineer and public works director. ASCE is the oldest national engineering society, and we represent over 150,000 civil engineers who serve as one of the stewards of our infrastructure here in the U.S. and around the globe. Every 4 years since 1998, ASCE has graded 16 major categories of infrastructure. And needless to say, since ASCE's first infrastructure report card, the grades have not been one to make us proud. We have yet to give an overall grade out of the Ds, and that remains true with our 2017 infrastructure report card. Our cumulative GPA is once again a D+, and that D+ represents the significant backlog of needs facing our nation's infrastructure. Decades ago, even a century ago in some cases, we built our current-day infrastructure. And like a roof on a house that you neglect to maintain, our systems are showing wear and tear. They've sprung leaks, they've worn down, they've become less reliable. Let's take the water sector. There's an estimated water main break every 2 minutes in this country, wasting 2 trillion gallons of drinking water. That's enough to fill the Empire State Building 7,000 times. We also depend on a network of roads and bridges that were envisioned and built during the Eisenhower era. Additionally, 44% of the nation's major roads are in poor or mediocre condition. Driving on those roads is costing motorists over $600 a year in vehicle repair and operating costs. And then there's congestion. 45% of Americans' urban interstates experience congestion during peak hours. On average, Americans waste between 40 and 120 hours a year in congestion. That's the equivalent of your 1 to 3 week vacation just stuck on the interstate. Rush hour is now rush hours, and we spend $170 billion a year in wasted time and fuel. Meanwhile, congestion at airports is growing. It's expected that 24 of the top 30 airports may soon experience Thanksgiving Day peak volume at least one day every week. In short, the grades and condition of our infrastructure is the cause for concern and reflect the fact that America's infrastructure bill is long overdue. We estimate that the investment gap over the next 10 years is just over $2 trillion. In other words, we need to be spending another $200 billion a year to bring our networks back into a state of good repair. And just over half that gap is in transportation. Failing to close this infrastructure investment gap brings serious economic consequences. According to ASCE's economic study Failure to Act, if we do not address the infrastructure gap by 2025, we can expect to see a loss of $3.9 trillion to our gross domestic product. That's equal to the gross domestic product of Germany today. Our businesses will lose $7 trillion by 2025, and we'll lose 2.5 million high-paying jobs because we are no longer competitive in the global economy. On top of that, it averages out that each American family is losing $3,400 a day in disposable income, more than $9 a day due to poor infrastructure. That's income we could be saving and spending on other things. We're really paying this price and we're getting nothing for it. If we're serious about achieving a national infrastructure system fit for the 21st century, we have to take now. The first step for this Congress should be to fix the Federal Highway Trust Fund. You've heard from labor and you've heard from business, and you'll hear from us. We recommend increasing the federal motor fuels tax by $0.05 a year for 5 years. That would provide a much-needed infusion of nearly $400 billion into the Highway Trust Fund. While this is a specific solution, we agree that all options ought to be on the table. The investment backlog doesn't end with transportation. We have needs across all 16 categories of infrastructure, with acute needs in drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and transit, which got our lowest grade at a D-. ASCE thanks the committee for holding this hearing on a topic that affects the quality of life and economic prosperity and livelihood of every American. We must commit today to make our vision of the future a reality. American infrastructure system that is the source of our prosperity. ASCE and its 150,000 members look forward to working with the House Committee on Ways and Means to improve America's infrastructure so that every family, community, and business can thrive. Thank you.
We thank the gentleman. Mr. Spear, would you please begin?
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Brady, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the American Trucking Associations. The ATA is an 86-year-old federation representing 50 state trucking associations. Our industry supports more than 7.7 million employees, or 1 in 18 jobs in the United States, where a truck driver is the top job in 29 states. In Massachusetts, trucks haul 98% of the freight and 2/3 of the freight delivered from Texas. Nationally, trucking moves 71% of the domestic freight tonnage. That's more than $10 trillion worth of goods. In fact, more than 80% of the U.S. communities rely exclusively on trucks, which in turn rely on a national network of roads and bridges that define interstate commerce. Without trucks, our cities, towns, and communities would lack key necessities, including food and drinking water. There would be no clothes to purchase and no parts to build automobiles or fuel to power them. The rail, air, and water intermodal sectors would not exist in their current form without the trucking industry to support them. And every time the government makes a decision that affects the trucking industry, those impacts are also felt by individuals and the millions of businesses that could not exist without trucks. Our roads and bridges are literally crumbling. Just last month, chunks of falling concrete struck cars traveling under bridges in California and Massachusetts. We are no longer facing a future highway maintenance crisis. We're living it. And every day we fail to invest, we're putting more lives at risk. In nearly 53% of the highway fatalities, the condition of the roadway contributed. Time wasted sitting in bottleneck traffic rather than at work or with our families has skyrocketed. Motorists now pay an average of $1,600 due to repairs and congestion each year. Trucking now loses $74.5 billion sitting in gridlock. That equates to 1.2 billion lost hours, or 425,000 truck drivers sitting idle for an entire year. These are the regressive and escalating costs of doing nothing. And they are reflected in the prices we all pay. These costs are measurable and should serve as offsets for new spending on our nation's infrastructure. ATA believes our nation's roads and bridges should be paid for by users. While trucks make up just 4% of the vehicles on our nation's highways, trucking pays nearly half of the Highway Trust Fund, and we're willing to pay more. ATA advocates the passage of a Build America Fund consisting of a modest increase in the price of fuel. The Build America Fund would increase the price of fuel 20 cents a gallon at the fuel rack, just a nickel a year over 4 years, generating $340 billion over 10 years. This new revenue for our nation's roads and bridges is real, not fake funding like P3s or asset recycling. The Build America Fund is the most conservative proposal, costing less than 1 cent on the dollar to administer versus up to 35 cents on a dollar for tolling schemes. Lastly, our proposal is sustainable. It shores up the Highway Trust Fund and doesn't add 1 dime to our nation's debt. In summary, our nation's growing economy is placing significant demand on all transportation modes. Federal inaction has prompted cash-strapped states to adopt regressive revenue schemes that hurt commuters, communities, and divert funds to non-infrastructure priorities. Look no further than the 10-mile stretch of I-66 just minutes away from this hearing room. A year ago, this short patch of Virginia interstate went to congestion pricing. As a result, I-66 commuters now pay a peak toll of $47.50 one way, one day, one road. For many who can't afford peak prices, they are either forced to drive through residential areas and school zones or navigate a costly maze of public transportation connections, which are often delayed or down due to underinvestment. This is the essence of regressive. In our future, if you choose to devolve your constitutional authority to the states. In contrast, if motorists paid the average toll, the cost of a 10-mile trip over an 8-day period on I-66, their cost for an entire year under ATA's Build America Fund for all roads and bridges in the United States. President Reagan understood why our approach makes the most sense, which is why he signed a user fee twice into law during his administration. Now is the time for Congress and this president to come together and do what's right for America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Scribner, would you please proceed?
Chairman Neal, Ranking Member Brady, and members of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify before you today. In recent years, there have been increasing calls to raise federal fuel excise tax rates in order to address what many have called an infrastructure crisis. To be sure, there are very real infrastructure needs in the U.S., but they are not uniform across infrastructure asset classes and are not primarily the result of a lack of federal funding. A more targeted approach is needed to best address these challenges. This would involve reassessing the federal role in the provision of transportation infrastructure, examining alternatives to existing user taxes, and removing government barriers to investment. First, contrary to common narrative, infrastructure does not face a broad immediate crisis in the U.S. Of the $250 billion spent by all levels of government on surface transportation infrastructure each year, which is the majority of total government infrastructure spending, the federal government is responsible for about 1/4, with state and local governments funding the remainder. As a share of GDP, public spending on transportation infrastructure has remained stable over the last 4 decades. In highways, the number of structurally deficient bridges and pavement roughness have been steadily declining over the last 3 decades. We do see infrastructure problems of varying degrees concentrated in our cities. The failure of state and local governments to carry out routine maintenance, as they agreed to do in exchange for receiving federal capital funding, has led to the decay of mass transit systems, airports, urban surface streets, and water and wastewater networks. This bad behavior by grant recipients should not be rewarded by federal taxpayers. Second, Congress should reassess the federal role in transportation infrastructure. The continued lopsided federal role in capital spending, as opposed to operations and maintenance, has created perverse incentives for state and local governments to build rather than maintain. In particular, this has led to significant overexpansion of mass transit. To put this mass transit spending in perspective, just 5% of American workers commuted to work by transit in 2017. Yet mass transit received 28% of total government surface transportation funding, more than 5 times its commuting mode share and 11 times more its share of total commuting and non-commuting trips. While the largely user-supported highway system moves more than $10 trillion worth of freight every year, mass transit moves 0 freight while enjoying 20 cents of every dollar collected from road users under current federal policy. A rationalized federal role in transportation infrastructure would focus on projects with true national significance that facilitate interstate commerce and international trade. The Constitution explicitly recognizes these roles as federal functions. A mass transit system that exists largely to move local commuters and that does not move any freight cannot be appropriately labeled a nationally significant project. Third, federal transportation infrastructure policy should realign with the user pays principle. As the vehicle fleet becomes increasingly fuel efficient and eventually electrifies, per-gallon taxation will no longer be suitable on either efficiency or equity grounds. Alternatives to existing user taxes are needed. In the short term, this would mean eliminating federal prohibitions on states tolling their own highway segments to augment existing fuel tax revenue. In the long term, this would mean examining a shift away from per-gallon taxation entirely and toward a mileage-based user fee. Finally, Congress should eliminate federal barriers to infrastructure investment. In addition to repealing the tolling prohibition I just mentioned, Congress should also eliminate the aggregate volume cap on private activity bonds to encourage more private sector investment in public purpose infrastructure. Similarly, the federal cap on the airport passenger facility charge unnecessarily restricts local self-help. Furthermore, Congress should continue to examine bipartisan reforms to procurement, labor, and environmental rules that may unnecessarily increase costs. The focus of these reforms should be on maximizing returns on infrastructure investment, not maximizing the number of temporary construction jobs. As Harvard University urban economist Edward Glaser recently noted, quote, "Treating transportation infrastructure as yet another public works program ensures the mediocrity that we see all around us," unquote. From highways to airports, current federal law perversely reduces transportation infrastructure investment while increasing government spending and pressure on taxpayers. Given this environment, it is unsurprising that many Americans are skeptical of calls for higher taxes to fund more infrastructure spending. The evidence suggests they should be. And with that, thank you again for the opportunity to testify before the committee, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Scribner. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions for the witnesses. Consistent with committee practice, I will first recognize those members present at the time the gavel came down in order of seniority. I will begin by recognizing myself to inquire. Mr. Trumka, in your testimony, you advocated for an infrastructure investment plan that lifts up working people, grows the economy, creates high-road jobs, and provides increased opportunity for people of color, women, and immigrants. For too long, these communities have been underrepresented in our jobs and in the building trades. How can a robust infrastructure package contribute to inclusive job growth and ensure that these communities have an opportunity for high-paying jobs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And of course, first of all, this program will create a number of high-paying jobs. Second of all, with the gentrification of most cities, people of color have had to move further and further out. Good transit systems are necessary to get them to the job opportunities. Each year, more and more women and people of color are joining our apprenticeship programs. The North American Building Trades Unions, our Building Trades Department, made a commitment over a decade ago to bring more women and people of color into construction by establishing apprenticeship readiness programs, ARPs. They have three characteristics. One, they're to increase the number of qualified candidates for apprenticeships across all trades. Two, increase the diversity of apprenticeship candidates by recruiting women and people of color and veterans. And three, increase the retention rate among apprentices by providing them with deeper understanding of both the industry and the role of craft unions in construction. Currently, there are over 150 of those programs in effect. And let me give you the effect of three examples. The Gulf Coast Construction Career Center is in New Orleans. Over 400 people completed the Gulf Coast program over the last 3 years. African Americans made up 90% of the people enrolled, and women were 9%. In New York City, the Construction Skills Program placed 1,443 graduates into Union Apprenticeship Program. Roughly 90% of the program graduates are Black, Hispanic, or Asian. In Louisville, Kentucky, Kentuckian Works trained 293 members from underserved communities, including women and people of color, in construction skills, and placed 111 graduates into construction jobs in the industry. Women make up 9% of the construction industry, but they make up 25% of our apprenticeship graduates each year. So things are moving in the right direction. In 2018, 68% of our graduates were people of color. We're proud of the progress that we've made. We still have much to do. I'm not saying that the job is anywhere near done, but we are headed in the right direction, and a robust infrastructure program will help those communities as much as it helps anybody.
Thank you, Mr. Trumka. Mr. Donohue, it's clear that the U.S. desperately needs a robust investment, as you've described, to revitalize and build new infrastructure. In your written testimony, you stated that the Chamber supports a multifaceted approach that leverages more public and private resources. I certainly agree that we need several tools to help close the infrastructure investment gap. In the past, taxable direct pay bonds have been a helpful tool in attracting investment, particularly for airports, for long-term infrastructure projects in the U.S. They were not reauthorized. Does the Chamber support reissuing taxable direct pay bonds, and do you think this would be helpful in attracting increased investment in U.S. infrastructure?
Mr. Chairman, the Chamber will support expanding and approving a number of opportunities for us to get the resources we need to move forward in an aggressive way. You listened this morning to 3 or 4 very interesting ideas on how to move forward, but all of them were about the same thing, and that is go to programs that now exist or existed in the past, and if necessary, add a few. We will all get together and support what we finally decide on, but the bottom line is, if there's no cash, there will be no dash. And we have got to work on this, and I look forward to working with you and the members of this committee to get the support behind, from every source, behind moving forward. Mr. Trumka and I are sort of a Mike and Ike show. We go all over the country and talk about it. We're getting tired of that. We need to be here, more often and get a decision on the financing. And thank you very much for setting up this meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Donohue. Mr. DiLoretto, you stated in your testimony that by 2025, our infrastructure gap will end up costing each American family $3,400 per year, or $9 a day. Now, that's not literal cash that comes directly out of our wallet, so it might be hard for people to feel that in a concrete way. Could you explain a bit more how underinvesting in our infrastructure costs people real money?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I've been speaking all over the country and even outside of the United States on the need to invest for infrastructure. And I've been doing it for 6 years now to business groups and elected official groups. And when I first started, I asked the same question. Well, I'm not spending $3,400 a year, am I, on infrastructure? And then I started looking at it, and I started talking to people, and guess what? It might not be $3,400, but it is real cash. For instance, my brother just wrecked the rim of the tire on his car and had to get it fixed, and it was $1,000. That's real cash. Every time we burn a tank of gas sitting on the interstate, that's real cash. That adds into it. Anytime an airplane's delayed and you might have to make a ticket exchange. I know I fly United a bunch. It's $200 a ticket exchange. That's real cash. I ran a large water utility in the Portland, Oregon area. Every time we had a water break, we made sure that our residents, our customers, had access to bottled water. That was a real cost that had to fold back into the rates the next year when we were charging our customers. Your businesses that are stuck in traffic. Plumber comes out to my home to fix the plumbing, charges for travel time. Longer it takes for them to get there, the more I have to pay. And if they don't charge it, then the rate I'm paying. That's all real cash. So when you start to think about it in those terms, it averages $3,400. And you might pay $5,000 and you might pay $200, but it's real cash and we're really paying it.
We thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Brady, to inquire.
And again, Chairman Neal, thank you for holding this important hearing. Thanks for the witnesses as well and the insight you provide. So America's economy is back in a way a lot of people didn't think it could be. We're seeing new investment from virtually every size businesses in every corner of this country. I toured 2 new manufacturing plants in my district last week in 2 of the poorer counties that we have in East Texas. Investment that used to be flat 2 years ago is growing at 7%. And R&D investment, research and development, is triple the rate it was for the average of the last 10 years. And for the first time, businesses are making location decisions to put their plants not overseas, but here in the United States. Manufacturing, research, intellectual property, the headquarters, all key things. So that kind of growth really demands new infrastructure. But new infrastructure also expands more growth. It is a virtuous cycle. That's why we're excited that you're here today. So I want to start with Mr. Donohue. First, thank you for your leadership of the Chamber since 1997, your leadership on tax reform, your leadership on expanding trade, including the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, your leadership on removing the regulatory barriers that can slow our economy down. One of the ideas around, I want to get this one out of the way, so one of the ideas floating around here is increasing the corporate tax rate to 24% percent and using those dollars for infrastructure. So can you tell us why that is such a bad idea, and if the chamber would oppose that approach?
First, let me say that the fact that we lowered taxes on corporations is among the important steps taken that have got us the lowest unemployment rate in 60-some years. That has put lots of people back to work. There's even a large number of people who have come off disability issues to go back and take up jobs that are available. In many industries, trucking, for example, we're out of workers. We're just out of workers. And so we have to work on all of those issues. And going in and deciding to take money out of the private sector in a way that you just described is not where we ought to go at this point. My view is more people working, more taxes are going to be paid, more people that are not taking the pressure, putting additional pressure on public support, and we are moving in a positive way. The politics of taxes have, go all the way back to the time of Christ, and we know what they are. The issue here
Did you want to go through that whole litany since then, or?
No, because it gets a little sticky. But the issue today, Leader, is that we have to make decisions about infrastructure without taking apart other parts of the issue of the actions of government and the private sector that have created this significant growth in economic benefit to this country. And the higher the growth rate is, the more we're going to have the resources to take care of the nation's challenges. And this committee, among its other serious challenges, should put infrastructure right at the top. If I have talked around your question, let me be clear, we're not going to be supporting that idea.
You've never talked around a question in your life, so thank you, Mr. Donahue, for that. Quickly, to you and Mr. Scrivener, you cited $100 billion in global capital looking to invest in infrastructure. I'm convinced that this is an important way we can augment funding for major infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, but looking at the full picture. Most of the recommendations on how to do this is simply let us borrow more cheap money. But is that the only thing, the only redesign that would draw more private capital into the larger infrastructure pictures? What else can we be doing? Mr. Scrivener?
As I said in my testimony, I think there are barriers to private investment right now. I think the big one is you're denying institutional investors like pension funds who would be willing to invest in public-private partnerships, say a toll road, but we don't allow toll roads over much of the system. So I think that is where we should start, and I'm not saying that this is a one-size-fits-all approach. It's certainly not. What works in New Jersey won't work in rural Montana, but we should free the states to experiment with these different approaches.
Thank you. Yield back, Chairman.
All right, thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Lewis, to inquire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. I can recall almost 54 years ago when we had a meeting with President Johnson. He said, in effect, if you want this project, it was the Voting Rights Act in 1965. He said, if you want it, make me do it. Make me do it. You're going to make us do it. And we need to do it. So thank you for being here to testify. I agree with you. Several members of my family drive big trucks in the Southeast to make a living. And I travel some of the roads and some of the highways. We can do better. Some of our roads highways look like third world countries. We can do, it's not safe. We can do better, much better. So let's do it. Find a way to dramatize the issue. I'm with you, 100%. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Buchanan, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all our distinguished witnesses. I want to take a little bit of a liberty. My good friend Tom Donahue, there's nobody with his background. He was 13 years in trucking and running that, and then he came on the Chamber 23 years ago and has done a magnificent job. I will note that they have over 3 million businesses they represent across the country, and the nice thing about it is 96% are fewer than 100 employees each. So to me, that says a lot about the Chamber. Maybe a lot of people don't realize that. Also, I want to say I started my career here 4 years, my first 4 years on the Transportation Committee. I represent Florida, part of Florida, but Florida, I look at that just in general. With the growth there, we've gone from 7 million to 22 million people. In the last 30 or 35 years, they're expecting another 4 or 5 million in the next 7 or 8 years. We've got to find a way to get in front of it. We've got more and more gridlock. Everybody, in a sense, comes to Florida, loves it, but we're starting to have real traffic issues in our cities and everywhere else. And as you know, a lot of these projects, you have to be thinking down the road 30 to 50 years, but we need to be doing something together, and I would just say clearly on a bipartisan basis. Mr. Donahue, let me ask you, in terms of the dollars, I mean, we can talk about how we're going to pay for it, but what is the investment, in your opinion, considered opinion today, that we need to be making now or in the immediate future?
Well, thank you very much for your thoughtful comments. You know, here we talk a lot about 10-year cycles. I really believe to fix our nation's infrastructure, to get ahead of all of the challenges that are being discussed here, we have to look at this thing as a 30 or 40-year project, because just think how long it's going to take to fix the roads, bridges. Think how long it's going to take to build new airports, to build new ports, to dredge out the inland waterways, to work on water systems in cities all over this country. This is a massive effort which should be looked at like other massive efforts, and that is to strengthen our military, which both houses of the Congress went forward in the last session to move the resources needed there. We need an effort like this, but everything has to start someplace, and the starting someplace is to increase the fuel tax to do roads, bridges, and forms of transit. You're going to have this support for that as well in the states, and I believe you'll get it. Then when you come to the major projects that are specific to individual states, airports, ports, the dredging, the water projects, all of that, you know, we have to be a little creative here. The Congress of the United States can't write trillion-dollar checks year after year to do this, but there are creative ways. There are ways to do private-public partnerships.
Hey, Tom, let me take a second, because we get 5 minutes. I wanted to ask you about permitting. It's one of your pillars that you had talked about just quickly. What, you know, projects that should take, you want to try to get done in a couple of 3 years, could take 5 to 10 years. What's your thought and the Chamber's thought on how we, you know, smooth that process out where that makes sense?
I'll give you a real quick answer. There have been some recent improvements on permitting, but if we don't get a permitting commodity or element in this effort that we're going to do, we ought not do it, because we have got to say to communities, look, you get a rational amount of time to work on your permitting. You may get one level of lawsuits, but after that, if you're looking at years and years to get it approved, then this committee ought to set the structure with the Transportation Committee that if you don't get a permit, we move the money somewhere else. You'd be surprised how quickly permitting will begin to work better.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, I'll recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you for your testimony. I think it's valuable. It's hardly novel. In fact, as some of you have noted, you've been offering the same testimony year after year after year in Congress and across the country. And while this committee has been guilty of gross neglect in not addressing the funding of infrastructure for most of the last 10 years, I'm pleased we have a hearing finally today. We know that when it comes to roadways and railways and airports and water and wastewater and flood control, we have a great need, and we have a great will in this Congress to talk about it. The only will that's lacking is the willingness to pay for it. We know that freeways are not free, and that to just maintain the current inadequate system that has given us a great grade of D+ on our transportation infrastructure, if we want to just maintain a second or maybe third-rate system that allows us to continue to fall behind our competitors, the best estimate I've seen is that that will cost us, just that second or third-rate system, about $160 billion over the next 10 years. As we look at those funding needs, I think it is important that we not get worse than we are now, and I was particularly struck by the amazing proposal of President Trump over the last 2 years that he would change the funding formula, reverse it, so that instead of an 80-20 federal match, he would change it to a 20-80 federal program. I don't think any of you have indicated you support such a reversal, and I hope he is reversing on that. At the same time, as we look at this, I think we do need incentives for the states to do their part. We don't want to have them say, well, after so many years of neglect on this issue, we no longer have to bear a burden on this also. In fact, I would like to see any initiative we have focus on incentives for the states to do more. Some states, as you pointed out, have made the hard political decisions to do more, and others, like Texas, have just waited for the federal government to do something as our infrastructure becomes more and more frail. Anything we do here in order to provide the funding, as you well know, and it's good to see labor and management, business and labor here together, as well as our other experts, will have to be done on a bipartisan basis. And that will be particularly challenging. We have just seen within recent months the current minority leader, Mr. McCarthy, make the question of investing in infrastructure that California did almost his only issue in the elections, from governor to Congress to dog catcher, that if you voted for any increased revenue for infrastructure, you were doing harm to the state. I think without a commitment of a substantial number of Republicans to back an infrastructure funding bill, we will have a true bridge to nowhere. It will not get us where we need to be. And we need an unequivocal commitment from President Trump, something that's very difficult to get in public, to a specific plan before that can happen. So I hope you will focus your attention there as well as here. One thing that does need to be included that he probably won't be very enthusiastic about, but I think is an essential part of any infrastructure plan, is addressing the existential threat of climate change. Gone are the days when we can forget the impact of fires and hurricanes and floods on our infrastructure. Indeed, I'm sure, Mr. DiLoretto, that our engineers already give considerable attention to the effect of global warming, of heat on our roadways, of flooding and water and hurricanes on our infrastructure. And it's essential that any bill we passed require looking to see whether we are adequately considering those factors, whether we are simply adding to the carbon impact on our economy, or we're looking at smart projects that get us in the right direction. I think in addition to the infrastructure projects that you've talked about, and a little out of what has been the traditional scope of infrastructure, we also need to be looking at what we can do with energy technology, with clean electricity, other forms of energy efficiency, and strengthening our electric grid, The military, the Defense Department has been a leader in this area, but we need to be looking at that as well as a key part of an overall comprehensive infrastructure bill that I hope can be approved on a bipartisan basis. I appreciate your contribution to the effort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel. I think the discussion here today is thoughtful. It is in depth, at least somewhat, and certainly, I think, constructive as we do move forward on very serious issues. I think we can all agree that we have unmet infrastructure needs across our country, and what that means to various parts of our country can mean different things. But as the representative of one of the nation's most rural and in many cases remote districts, we have a lot of infrastructure, a little different than perhaps the metro subway and other mass transit. But we also have the world's largest rail classification yard, Bailey Yard in North Platte. We have more than 3,000 dams in the state, thousands of miles of irrigation canals. We have a large portion of the existing Keystone Pipeline as well as the proposed route for the Keystone XL pipeline. We have more than 65,000 square miles of land, the vast majority of which is privately owned across 75 counties. I could go on with more details about my district, but I do have concerns that simply raising the gas tax without implementing other reforms would merely get us a more expensive version of the status quo, which we know troubles most of us. But let me be clear, our job in this committee is to figure out how to fund infrastructure, not necessarily make the rules for projects, but I certainly want to reflect on the fact that I have concerns about moving forward with increasing a tax without some corresponding reforms and improvements in public policy. So I hope we can get there. I hope that we can continue a constructive discussion as we are having today. Mr. Scribner, you referenced the need to address issues such as labor requirements, permitting rules, and lack of life cycle cost accounting to improve how transportation dollars are spent. Could you briefly expand on those comments?
Yeah, thank you, Representative Smith. So those are areas where we see great variation. Say, take labor regulations, for instance. If you're in a high union density state and we're getting a federal top-down labor requirement, that may not impact you very much because you have the workers of that type of workforce are already unionized. But if you go to a state with lower union density, that's where you can see substantial cost increases to those projects. So this is the same goes for environmental permitting requirements, the lack of life cycle costing, where we may get a low bid on the initial construction, but that doesn't take into account the entire project life and those costs that are borne across that time span. So I think we need some basic standards and to recognize that one size doesn't fit all, that certain solutions are going to work better in different states than in others. But as you said, simply increasing the fuel tax and spending more money through the current channels is just going to be a more expensive status quo.
Okay, thank you. It was mentioned earlier about climate change, and the efforts have been described in a number of ways. But Mr. Speer, can you elaborate a little bit in terms of how your industry is already acting on efficiency of energy consumption and various methods there?
Certainly, Congressman. The two highest costs to our industry are labor and fuel. So it is in our best interest to find newer technologies that make the equipment more energy efficient. We're obviously looking ahead 5, 10, 15 years out at alternative fuel vehicles. But in the near term, it's making diesel-powered tractors more efficient. And I think you're seeing tremendous strides in terms of the technology that's coming out of our truck and trailer OEMs. So we believe that the savings that you can get by investment in infrastructure could have a dramatic impact on reducing our carbon footprint. I mentioned $74.5 billion our industry loses each year sitting in traffic. That's 425,000 drivers sitting idle for an entire year. That is a very measurable amount of CO2 that we're emitting, and we're just 4% of the vehicles on the road. So we're moving 71% of the economy, but 4% of the vehicles on the road. So you count in all the passenger vehicles that are sitting in traffic, that is a huge impact on the climate. So investing in infrastructure does make a difference, and it will certainly have a benefit to the environment.
Thank you. And just briefly, Mr. DiLoretto, the annual report card that you do highlights the grades. Can you explain briefly how rail infrastructure received the highest grade of any sector?
Absolutely, Congressman Smith. Rail actually did a lot of investment in their system, some $20 billion in 1 year alone. And it was those investments that they made in the freight rail system that got their grade up. So where we see categories of infrastructure that invest, the grades go up. The condition is better, handles the capacity, operations and maintenance are taken care of. And that's how they got the highest grade.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson, to inquire.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you for finally holding this important hearing on our nation's infrastructure. And thank you to all of the witnesses who took time to be here today and for all that you're doing outside of this hearing room to make sure everyone understands the importance of adequate investment in our infrastructure. You know, in 2017, the American Society of Civil Engineers issued a study, the Infrastructure Report Card on our nation's infrastructure. They gave it a D+ and said it was in poor condition. They said things like, there's a strong risk of failure. In my home state of California, there's about 180,000 miles of public roads. 45% are said to be in poor condition. And our population is expected to grow by nearly 50 million people in the next 22 years. So it's highly likely that this is only going to worsen. It seems to me that this is more than just an inconvenience. There are tremendous costs, as some of you have mentioned, to businesses, to our communities, to people, in the amount of time that they lose, in their property, and most certainly in their health. Mr. DiLoretto, what's the impact to the everyday people across our country as we just continue to ignore this problem?
Yes, sir, Congressman Thompson. You know, I retired a few years ago, and I don't have to drive in rush hour traffic anymore. But every now and then...
But everybody else. What's the impact on everybody else?
Exactly. But every now and then I do. And it seems like I try not to be on the road after 3:30. The impact is, how do you sit there in that traffic, missing soccer games, missing things in your life? It's a quality of life issue if you're the resident. It's a business issue if you're sending your goods and services. That's the impact that each and every one of us sends every day. And, you know, we've kind of just, I guess, accepted it. We need to get it fixed and get our quality of life back.
Mr. Spear, can you add anything to that, given the importance of, although only 4%, the importance of trucking to our country?
Absolutely. I think that you know, the congestion is really a measurable element to your infrastructure proposal. I mentioned the fuel, the CO2, but the productivity losses to our industry and the economy, those costs are passed on to all of us. What you eat, what you drink, the clothes you wear, the medications we take, we pay higher prices for that. The longer it sits in traffic, that's all transcending to the consumer. Very measurable. Lost times with families. I mean, just a recent study last month, I was testifying before the Senate Commerce Committee. Washington, D.C. is right now ranked #2 in terms of congestion. 155 hours sitting in traffic? That's an entire month.
Thank you.
A month. I mean, you can calculate how much productivity is lost by our workforce sitting there. And if you're a truck driver moving 71% of the economy, we're already short 50,000 drivers. If I'm sitting in traffic, I've got to be sitting there thinking, man, I could be doing something much better with my life. I'm getting paid by the mile, and I'm not moving.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that the issue of disaster resilience has been injected into this hearing today. I come from a district that's had our fair share, earthquakes, fires, floods, and I know I have legislation, the Earthquake Mitigation Tax Incentive Act, and I hope that my bill and others will be thought of and talked about in this debate. We need to do more to help communities, protect communities, and our public investment investment in any infrastructure. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that because this Congress played a big role in it, the flood project in my home county of Napa, downtown Napa, used to flood every year. We've lost lives, lost businesses, and we had the biggest flood we've had in decades this last week, and the project worked. There were no problems at all. So we need to continue to talk about that and protect our investments. And then just lastly, I know it's not a fix for everything, but it seems to me a national infrastructure bank is an important component as we move forward and discuss what we do with infrastructure. And if anyone would like to add to that, I'd be all ears. The infrastructure part, I guess, infrastructure bank part.
The issue of an infrastructure bank is discussed all the time. It's, there are similar issues around the world. When you start a bank, you've got to put money in it.
We did it in California. It was my legislation, and it's helped a lot in infrastructure investment.
I promised to look into California's infrastructure issues. I know you've been through
you guys supported it back then.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Marchant, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I look forward to working with the committee on solutions to fund this infrastructure expansion that we're talking about. I appreciate the people back in my district. The region that I represent is a very forward-thinking region. They have a major airport, regional airport in their district, have more tollway miles than any other district in the state of Texas. We have over 100 million square feet of warehouse facilities around that airport and major distribution points. Our local people are engaged in this issue. They have projects stacked up. They have projects ready to go. I have a letter here from signed by Mayor Franke from Cedar Hill, who serves as the chairman of the Regional Transportation Council, which is a group formed from the North Texas Council of Governments. And it's basically addressed to the Secretary of Transportation, but mainly covers items that affect the implementation of those projects once they have already reached a stage of being funded. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter this letter into the record, please. And
without objection.
The main emphasis of the letter is, other than revenue, asking that we make sure when we put together a revenue package that, and I think it's been mentioned a couple times before, that we not neglect the part of revising and streamlining our federal permitting process and our federal regulations so that we don't come up with this very elaborate revenue scheme that funds the thing and then finds out that it's almost impossible to implement at the local level. I'm a former mayor, former state legislator. This is the biggest concern. Always revenue is a concern, but it is the biggest concern that we have in our district. And if I may ask Mr. DiLoretto, with your background as a civil engineer, and can you talk to that issue a little bit and make some suggestions to the committee as to what would be categorically the thing that we ought to make sure is in this bill?
Well, clearly, Congressman mentioned, the first part, of course, is the funding, and we've talked about that. But you're correct. There is the issue of how we permit projects, and having had a number of projects when I was a city engineer, the process can be, quite cumbersome. And so obviously, the best way would be to help us streamline it by a more comprehensive approach, and Congress has done that. Certainly, I think in the last transportation bill, there was a streamlining of how we permit projects. Certainly, ASC, I will say, is not, we're not looking at let's remove some of certainly the environmental considerations that we have. More importantly, it's that we try to put a comprehensive permitting process together so that we're not going to this agency and doing it, and then we go to that agency, and then we have to go back to this agency. Some way that we can pull that together in a comprehensive, and I did that on one of our major projects. Unfortunately, the project didn't get built, but we did have the opportunity to take advantage of might have been a trial program that the federal government was doing with the Corps of Engineers as the head, and it turned out to be really advantageous for us by having a comprehensive, unified approach to the permitting process.
I also think that coming from a state that over the years has had a very effective design-build program and a streamlined environmental impact process, not to avoid that process, but to streamline it and allow these projects to move along and these processes not to be number one, number two, number three, but to move along at the same time. Mr. Scribner, what other kind of funding mechanisms can we talk about other than just an outright new tax?
Yeah, thank you for that question. As I say in my testimony, I think there are barriers to some of these public-private partnerships that we've seen, including in Texas. And I think we should, perhaps out of the federal level, encourage those, although I would. But we should certainly not stand in the way of states experimenting with these projects. They've worked very well internationally. They've worked well in the United States where they have been done on the limited basis that they have been done. But as you said with design build, there's no reason we should be doing design bid build anymore, design build at the least. But I would like to see a lot more design build, finance, operate, maintain, concession projects and bring in that private investment that right now we're just not seeing much here. But things like that, asset recycling that's been successful in Australia, these are all things that we should be looking at as opposed to just raising existing tax rates.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this hearing. I thank the witnesses. I especially want to commend our Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves. I think they're spot on. No pun intended, but this is where the rubber meets the road here in terms of addressing the issue of taxation. That old saying, if you want to dance, you have to pay the fiddler, could never be more true. And I thank the gentlemen, especially Mr. Trumka and Mr. Donahue, who've been doing this for some time, seemingly without Congress getting that the fierce urgency of now is present and here. And that's why I think it's so important that we take action. Mr. Spear, I especially appreciated your comments and the emotion behind what you were saying and the frustration that underscores everything that all of you had to say with respect to infrastructure. It's shared over here a frustration that's been building over the last 8 years of not even having, well, a hearing. So while this may seem novel, it's certainly an extraordinary step, but it certainly will not be an important step unless we follow through with action. There seems to be general consensus here that most of you at the table would be in favor of increasing the gas tax. Is that so? Could we just go down quickly? Mr. Scribner, would you be in favor of that?
No.
Mr. Spear?
Without question, yes.
Mr. DiLoretto?
Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Donahue?
Definitely.
Mr. Trumka?
Yes.
Thank you. It also seems that there was a general consensus that as we move forward also, what the chairman referred to as, and Mr. Graves especially, was the VMT. Is that something, Mr. Trumka, you would favor as you look forward? First on a pilot basis and then moving forward?
Yes.
Mr. Donahue?
I'd have to be convinced simply the multiplication of how you would run something like that is astronomical. If we're going to do it, let's do it after we up the fuel tax and start building some
With
stuff.
the qualification of after. Mr.
Yes,
Loretto.
ASCE supports that.
Mr. Spear?
We would qualify it. I think for the next 10 years, the user fee is the most viable solution for immediate income. Technology does have a role. our industry is willing to come to the table and look beyond 10 years. If it is a VMT-like model, we'll certainly want to be engaged in developing that.
Mr. Scribner.
Yes, absolutely.
Many of you may be aware of the fact that such liberal-minded thinkers like Jim Baker, George Shultz, Kevin Hassard, Martin Feldstein, Hank Paulson, Gary Kahn, Art Laffer, Rex Tillerson have all proposed a carbon tax. Would you favor a carbon tax as you look? And I know many of you said all things should be on the table. Mr. Scribner.
No.
Mr. Spear.
I would not.
Mr. DiLoretto.
ASCE would consider it one of the tools.
Mr. Donahue.
A increase in the fuel tax is a carbon tax.
We would have to see the details of it before.
I love the Irish, you know, they're great. Yes, Mr. Trump, I'm sorry.
I said we would have to see the details of it before we would commit.
Lastly, there's, I think, one of the most important things that this committee can do, and I can tell in the frustration, a common practice here in the Congress is that oftentimes these issues are debated. There's nobody on this dais that doesn't understand the urgency right now of funding an infrastructure program. There isn't a person here when asked to raise their hand and they're not for funding an infrastructure won't do it. Then when it comes to paying for it, everybody heads for the exit. But what you ought to be insisting on, and several of us have asked you to do this, is that if you vote no, you shouldn't be able to take the dough. And that's what happens too often up here, is that as you construct a compromise or you construct an opportunity to move forward, whichever mode that is, there ought to be some responsibility back on this side in terms of standing up and putting, if you want a project in your district, if you have roads that need to be built, you can't just vote no and say you were against that kind of tax increase, but then say, oh, but I was so happy to have everything built in my district. And that can only happen when you guys step forward and hold our feet to the fire. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. I would note that there are a lot of members of Congress who have made careers out of doing what you just described. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Reed, to inquire.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to follow Mr. Larson's comment, I think that concept, vote no, take the dough, has evolved into the vote no, hope yes caucus of our members. And I'm seeing some of that occur on both sides of the aisle as we go forward. So I appreciate this panel. I appreciate the conversation that we're having. And I think to echo Mr. Larson's comments that many of us, it's the trillion-dollar question of how you're going to pay for it. Where's the revenue going to come from? And I think what you're seeing in this debate is the classic dysfunction of Congress that we face right now. There's no trust amongst us here on Capitol Hill as well as with the White House. And so I think the trick that we have to identify is what is that moment where we can all join hands? Us in the House of Representatives, the leaders in the Senate and the Senate representatives, as well as the White House, because at that point in time, then we all jump together and we solve this problem going forward. And as we do that, one of the philosophical issues that I think we need to hammer down today at this hearing is there's a lot of discussion going around Capitol Hill about untying the infrastructure investments from the user fee-based model. And they're looking at these pots of money that are new revenue sources that have nothing to do with infrastructure. I've heard legalized marijuana as the panacea for this issue. I've heard financial transactions tax as the panacea for this issue. And one of the things that struck me in your testimony, Mr. Scribner, when I read it, was you were a very strong proponent of making sure that the longstanding user pay, user benefit fiscal principle of the infrastructure tax be adhered to. Can you articulate to me exactly why you feel so passionately about that, and what is the downside of decoupling our infrastructure revenue sources, be it what they may be, from a user fee system to a general revenue bucket of money to try to tie into?
Thank you for that question. Yes, we've long supported the user pays principle as the bedrock for sound transportation policy, and I'll answer that by kind of reframing it as to what advantages does that have over general revenue appropriations. The first is fairness. Highway users benefit from the improvements their user taxes benefit or generate. So, those are the most direct beneficiaries. We can talk about broader economic impacts, but ultimately it's the users who primarily benefit. Second, proportionality. Users who drive more pay more. That's also an element of fairness. Third, funding predictability. Highway use and therefore highway user revenue doesn't fluctuate very widely in the long run, or in the short run rather. And then fourth, and I think this is important, signaling investment. Because of that third element, because revenue roughly tracks use, this provides policymakers with an important signal as to how much infrastructure investment is needed to achieve a desired level of efficiency and where. So that's, I think, those are the four key advantages.
And what is the risk of decoupling? Let me ask this on the panel before. Does anybody on the panel, from Mr. Trumka, Mr. Donahue, Mr. DiLardo, and Mr. Spear, propose a general revenue increase in order to fund the infrastructure? Because every proposal I read in your testimony, it seemed to be a user fee-based model. Mr. Trumka?
We're willing to look at any funding source because the cost of inaction is more than the cost of acting. In addition to that, we'll look at anything.
You're open to marijuana tax, you're open to
We'll look at whatever it takes.
Mr. Donahue? Are you willing to violate the user fee principle that's funded our infrastructure for decades?
I've watched problems.
I only got a minute. Yes, no.
I'm not willing to.
Thank you. Mr. DiLardo.
I don't know if they're mutually exclusive. So, I mean, we certainly look at all of the revenue sources that would go in.
So you're willing to decouple from the user fee model?
We want both. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Spear?
As I testified, we support the user fee model. It should be paid for by the people that use it.
Okay, thank you. So what is the risk if we decouple, Mr. Scrivener?
I think moving away from the trust fund and user tax model risks turning infrastructure into every other political issue that we see. And given these are massive projects, they take multiple years, billions of dollars oftentimes, that means that we're going to see dramatic costs and uncertainty spiral out of control.
And then that potential flag to the investment also is at risk, is it not? That your reference is one of the reasons why we use the user fee model?
Absolutely. You're going to be losing that signal, yeah.
So if you're looking for capital acquisition, capital markets to invest, especially if we go into a PPP type model, asset recycling and other issues, you're going to lose the potential revenue that people are willing to invest in there because they're not guaranteed what that revenue to cover that cost would be. Is that
correct? You're going to have a lot less information. The investors will have less information.
I appreciate that. Very good witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize a real thought leader on the whole question of infrastructure for a long period of time, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't thank you enough for calling this hearing. This is something I've been waiting for 8 years. I was saddened that my Republican colleagues could not find time for this hearing when they had 404 hearings in 8 years. This is, I think, the first step to restoring the trust that Mr. Reid talks about, because I think there were some members of the committee on the Republican side that would have welcomed it. I mentioned to Mr. Donahue and Mr. Trumka, it was almost exactly 5 years ago to the day that we were at Harvard Business School having essentially this same conversation. I presented, Mr. Rice might remember, he was there. I presented a proposal to raise the gas tax, index the gas tax, leverage the gas tax, and then ultimately replace the gas tax with something that was more sustainable. And those two gentlemen stole the show, gave my speech better than I did. I'm glad you've had more practice and that you're here with us today. But the only thing that has changed is that the federal government today is a less reliable partner. The Trump administration is sitting on an EIS for a multi-billion-dollar project for the Gateway project. It's been ready to go. Don't complain to me about problems with the administration and environmental regulations. They've had it sitting on their desk ready to go for multi-billion dollars that's costing us, what, $100 million a day in excess costs? We're ready to go. It doesn't have to be this partisan. I would ask that the staff distribute a letter from Ronald Reagan, a speech he gave November 27th, 1982. It was a brilliant speech when he called Congress back to more than double the gas tax. It passed with almost unanimous support, and the arguments he made today echo what we heard from at least 4 of our 5 witnesses today. I would really ask my Republican friends and my Democratic friends to look at this. I think we can have a start of a bipartisan effort to go forward. We have a president who campaigned on $1 trillion of infrastructure. And recently he's talked about $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion, and has allowed that he would support a gas tax increase in some instances. If we could have this conversation in every congressional district over the next 2 months, not with this distinguished panel, but with members of organized labor, members of local chambers and businesses, trucking, the 150,000 engineers, I'm convinced if we invited in to hear what America wants, what their needs are, and what they would support. Remember, we've been reminded since we didn't have a hearing, 33 states have put together bipartisan proposals to raise their infrastructure needs. And I would hope that we could work with you and with members of Congress to have those conversations across the country. Would you be willing to work with us to try and have those local conversations, those of you who have vast armies of people out there? Is that reasonable?
Absolutely.
We're working on it already.
And that would be my response as we go across the country. We are there.
We're in every 50 state. We'd be more than happy to have that conversation.
Look forward to seeing if we can piggyback on that effort to help members of Congress have this information. Mr. Spears, you touched on an item that gives some people pause about equity. Could you talk for a moment about the problems that low and moderate income Americans face now with our inaction?
Yeah, I repeatedly hear from opponents of the user fee increase that this is a regressive tax. What's regressive is not a 20-cent on the gallon increase, 5 cents a year over 4 years. What's regressive is doing nothing. The $1,600 that I testified on that people are averaging in terms of congestion and repairs to their vehicle, that's regressive. And that doesn't discriminate no matter how much money you make. Whether you're making $20,000 a year or $100,000 a year. You're still enduring that. If you're commuting, you're enduring that. My wife's here today. She came in for the hearing last month in the Senate Commerce Committee I testified at. She hit a pothole. $745 damage to her minivan. One trip in. I'm praying she didn't have that happen today. But I mean, it doesn't discriminate against her or anybody else that hits that hole. It's going to do damage, and you're going to pay for that. And it's measurable. 20 cents on a gallon over 4 years, 5 cents a year over 4 years. That's $340 billion over 10 years. That's real money, immediate into the trust fund. You're immediately going to see roads and bridges improving as a result of that. That $1,600 goes down exponentially. And you're paying just over $100 more at the pump for the entire year. That commuter on I-66, as I said, 8 days of that at average toll pays for an entire year under our Build America Fund for all roads and bridges, not just that 10-mile stretch. I mean, that's a no-brainer. That's an absolute no-brainer. That's equity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Earl, I agree with you when you talk about that, what President Reagan did, but I think we have to remember that when he put that price increase on, the price of a gallon of gas, I think in the early 80s was somewhere around $1.20 to $1.25 a gallon. So when you start adding taxes onto current prices and referring back to things several decades ago, it's like, well, let's put it in the right perspective of what it costs. You know, everybody agrees on this. Every single person agrees that we have to do this, whether it's our rails, our roads, our runways, our rivers. We've got to get this done. We've got to get this done. But I think Mr. Reed was very accurate. Then the question is, who pays for it? I've got one solution. We've talked a little bit about the private and public partnerships. There's a piece of legislation that I've introduced with Mr. Clay and Mr. Budd. It's called the GAIN Act. Some of you may agree with this, some of you may not. All it does is it directs the Department of Agriculture to assess and sell its distressed assets on the open market and return those funds directly to the Department of Treasury. Now, what would those monies be used for? Well, be used for infrastructure in areas of the country where nobody wants to invest, not just a dime, not even a penny, in poor areas. The other half of that revenue then would go to reduce our debt, so it's a win-win. That piece of legislation is going to be out there again this year, so I would hope that all my colleagues want to get on that to find a way, how do we get this done without putting too heavy a burden? By the way, that costs taxpayers absolutely nothing. So we've talked about it. Mr. Trump, you talked about it. Tom, you talked about it. Mr. DiLoretto, Mr. Spear, Mr. Scribner. The cost of doing nothing, how much that's going to come down to. Let me ask you also, the revenue produced by the cost of doing something, just in wage taxes alone, the other taxes that would be paid by the work that's being done. Does anybody have a figure on that? What kind of revenues would come into the Treasury? Mr. Spear.
Well, I can tell you from a highways and bridges perspective, we're advocating 20 cents. Tom's advocating a quarter. Ours is 5 cents a year over 4 years. That's $340 billion additional, additional. That's $34 billion a year. You're currently authorized under the FAST Act to do 60. You're currently bringing in under CBO 42, so you're
let me ask you, though, the other ancillary increases in revenue that would take place. I'm going to assume that the people fixing all these things are going to pay wage taxes, that the company's actually doing the work. Mr. Trump, just the union members, think of the number of people that would be put to work and looking at that 12.4% that comes out of everybody's paycheck that streams directly into Social Security. So we're saying, we're going to run out of money, we better do something about it. How about putting people to work? I mean, the cost, has anybody looked at what those numbers are? I'm really interested in this.
I have, actually. It's about 500,000 jobs under the Build America Fund that I testified on. In Pennsylvania, that's 19,000 jobs. So we can break it down and measure exactly how many
dollars and cents, I think, because that's what relates to where people pick up on back home. Because when you talk about that, says, yeah, that sounds like a lot of jobs. What does it mean in dollars and cents that helps shore up some of the spending that we have? So that's what I'm really concerned about that.
Well, certainly payroll wages, you're going to look at that.
Absolutely, that's what I'm talking about.
A driver coming into the federal general treasury.
Yeah, and profitable companies pay taxes also, right? So
absolutely.
It's a win-win across the board. Hey, one other thing, when we talk about user fees, you had made a comment about user fees and the people that those who use it should pay for it. But there's another aspect that those who benefit from it. So there's a double combination there. And this is, by the way, I'm not taking exception to what you said. I'm just thinking, we look so much about who this burden would fall on. I think what we forget is the benefit is for every single American. It's an incredible opportunity for us to come together and do something about it. I was looking the other day. I was talking with Chairman Brady. The number of electric cars, by the way, because they're not going to pay a gas tax, right?
It's less than 0.5% of all roads.
So there's 1 million on the road today, electric cars.
Correct.
Projected in the United States by 2030, 19 million. So if you don't have a user fee, and we've switched from gasoline-powered to electric-powered, the loss of revenue, because we won't have people buying gasoline and paying a tax on it, well then if it's not a user fee, how do you replace that loss of revenue?
Registration fees, certainly when they register the vehicle at DMV.
Well, you have to find an alternative is the answer, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, and we know it's trending.
And they should be captured, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, because I do believe that those who use it should pay for it, but also those who benefit. I got to thank you all for being here. Mr. Donohue, it's always good seeing you. Mr. Trump, you represent a lot of really great, hardworking Americans. Thank you all for being here today. Mr. Chairman, thanks for holding this. It's a great, great hearing. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Kine, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for teeing up this very important hearing today, long overdue, and I want to thank our witnesses for your very thoughtful testimony and the work that you've been doing for quite some time to develop consensus in this country about the need for us to move forward on such an important investment. But let me just first make a comment. You know, there's been a rising concern in this country about the rise of China and whether they're going to eat our cake here in the 21st century and overtake us. And I would submit that the way to beat China, the way to outcompete China is by making a crucial investment in a world-class infrastructure system right here in America so we lay the groundwork for long-term sustainable economic growth. The way to beat China isn't by erecting walls and creating barriers and slapping tariffs on them, but it's by investing in a world-class education and job training system so our citizens have the skills they need to compete and to be full participants in the 21st century global economy. The way to beat China is to win the 5G race on broadband deployment and to invest in basic and applied research so we can remain on the cutting edge of new scientific and medical and technological discoveries and breakthroughs so we can remain the most competitive and innovative nation in the world. That's what we ought to be focused on in order to beat China or any other rival economic power throughout the globe right now. And this is an important part of it. We've gotten very good at this place being able to recognize the challenges that we face. What we're lousy at is developing a solution and the consensus on how to move forward. And in this case, we've all been talking about a sustainable revenue source that's going to make sense. I'm going to challenge you all to help me or convince me on what that revenue source should be so I can sell it back home to my district, because in so many ways, geography really does influence policy around here. My good friend and colleague from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, she represents a congressional district roughly 5 square miles in Milwaukee. My rural western Wisconsin district is a little over 4 hours from Stevens Point down to the border of Illinois. And I'm going to have to be able to go home and convince my farmers and convince my families living in rural communities that whatever revenue source we come up with is going to be fair and it's going to make sense to them. And I would submit that all this talk about maybe transitioning to other revenue sources and that, we're only going to get one kick at this can for quite some time. Look how long it's taken us just to tee up this hearing. And so if we're going to move forward on something, this is something we're going to have to lock into with the expectation it's going to be with us for a very long time. And that's why I'm concerned about how committed you all are on the user fee model and whether we're on a collision course with technology and whether it's going to make sense for that low-income family in my rural western Wisconsin district on a fixed income, having to drive great distances, who can't afford the electric or hybrid vehicle, and whether they're going to fear that they're going to be paying a disproportionate burden on whatever revenue source. And we're going to need that help. Mr. Donahue, you said you got a contest going on at the chamber with new revenue sources and new ideas. But it sounds like you're pretty committed to the user fee model. And Mr. Trumka, you too expressed support for it. How open are you for looking at perhaps a more broad-based revenue source that is sustainable? Because I do submit to the notion that whether you're filling up a gas tank or whether you're driving on our roads or highways, all of us benefit from a sound infrastructure system in this country. So how committed are you to keeping your mind open to coming up with something?
Well, Congressman, if you look at our statement, you would find that we segmented roads, bridges, and transit and suggested let's go and deal with the user fee. And then we said this massive demand factor and need on airports, water systems, inland waterways, ports, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have said, we're ready to participate in 3, 4, 5, 10 creative ways to do this. You know what? When we had the big presentation, I said what we really all want to do is what we did when we bought our first house. We want to get the biggest house we can for the smallest price, with the best mortgage at the lowest rate, with the longest period of time. And we can do that with investors of many types from around the world to get the rest of the deal done. But right now, today, we're at great risk on roads and bridges, and we need to move on it. And the quickest way to do that is...
Since we're running out of time, I hope we also keep an open mind as far as the waterway infrastructure system of our country. I've got more miles on the Mississippi than any other member in Congress. And, you know, the 5G deployment in rural America is going to be a real challenge, too. So broadband, I think, makes sense within the broader infrastructure needs of our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly would like to make a request of the chair.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to submit a press release on the GAIN Act so that everybody can take a look at this. I think this is an incredibly important piece of legislation that really answers part of our question today about who's going to pay for it.
So ordered. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this very interesting hearing. I do believe that a lot of our problem in infrastructure comes from our incredibly overburdensome permitting process. We've been working on an interstate in my district, I-73, for almost 30 years now, and they began the permitting process over 10 years ago. When I got to Congress 6 years ago, it was at a standstill. It took me 4.5 years to get a permit, and then the environmental group, Coastal Conservation League, waited till the 175th day of their 180-day time period and sued us, and so we've been in a lawsuit for a year and a half now trying to get our permit. I think our permitting process is laughable. It makes us less competitive in the world, and I think other countries pass us by, and it's a restriction that we place on ourselves. It's a noose that we put around our own necks. We have nobody to blame but ourselves. You know, I tax lawyer and CPA, am pretty much of a pragmatist. I do understand and agree that $1 in 1993, the last time the gas tax was raised, was worth a lot more than it is today, and that if you expect the same level of service from a 2019 dollar that you did from a 1993 dollar, you're not thinking very clearly. So, and I do believe that infrastructure is investment. It's not spending money. If you do it properly, you do get a return on that investment. But I have one huge problem, and that is that I come from a fairly poor state, South Carolina, and some of the counties in my district are very poor. Some of them are the poorest in South Carolina. I mean, I have one county in particular with, you know, a net household income of about a little over $30,000. And I have two problems. One is that 20% of the gas tax that the people in that very poor county pay, it goes straight off the top to transit. Then they get any benefit from that at all. And second, South Carolina is one of, I think, 5 or 6 states that got back less than they paid in gas tax. From the time the gas tax was put in until 2008 when we started subsidizing that. So I hear you about investment, I hear you about your return. But what do I tell Mr. Spear? You explain it to my folks back home in that very poor county. The households make $35,000 a year, right? Why should they, 20% of their gas tax off the top, go to subsidize high-speed rail in California, the New York City subway system, the problems here, the metro system here in Washington? Why does that make sense for them?
Well, I think that the best way to do it is to look at what they're currently paying to repair their vehicles because of damage endured by roads and bridges.
20% of their gas tax goes straight off the top to transit, that they get no benefit from whatsoever. Why should they agree to pay that?
Well, it's a question for the T&I committee. Chairman DeFazio understands the current FAST Act authorizes up to 10% of the Highway Trust Fund to be spent on non-highway projects. We personally, pay half the tab in the trust fund as a trucking industry, only 4% of the vehicles on the road. We would like that money to go all into roads and bridges.
Mr. DiLoretto, how would you explain to these very poor families in South Carolina that they should be subsidizing these rich projects in rich states?
I think I'd take a different tact on it. The one thing we know is that regardless of where you live, men will outlive their ability to drive by about 7 years, and women will outlive their ability to drive by 10 years. So whether you live in any particular part, at some point you're going to need some kind of service other than you getting in your car.
Well,
I think you've got to look at that.
It doesn't exist in these poor counties right now. Mr. Donahue, how would you explain to them why they should subsidize these very expensive projects in these rich states?
You may not like my answer, but the reason that people from the trucking business, people from all over agreed to let those funds go to transit is you need to do that to get urban votes for rural roads.
Okay, so you're saying that's the only way that they can get it across the line?
Well, I think we'd all be harder pressed to get what we need here if we couldn't get urban votes for rural roads.
How do I explain to these very poor folks back in rural South Carolina why they should be taking 20% of their gas tax off the top to subsidize transit in these very rich states?
Well, I haven't looked at your state specifically, but I'd look at the overall intake and outtake. Because there's a lot of states that get more in.
South Carolina
than they
gets
pay out.
96, before the trust fund went negative and the federal government started to subsidize it, South Carolina was getting 96 cents back for every dollar it put in the gas tax.
I'm not just talking about the trust fund. I'm talking about taxes in general, because you may give somewhere here and get something over here. I'd like to look at that. But I'd also tell them this. The cost of inaction is costing them as well, because the products that they buy takes more time to be delivered. They have to have higher prices, and they're paying through the nose for not having all of that done. Look, I talked before, I was asked about funding sources, and I think Member Buchanan asked Tom how much he thought it would take. I'll tell you what our figures are. We think it'll take $2 trillion to bring the infrastructure up to a good state of repair, and another $2 trillion over 10 years to bring us into the 21st century. User fees are only going to be a part of that. We're going to have to fund a part of that some other way, and you may, your members, and I know about poor rural counties, because I come from one right next to the poorest in Pennsylvania. They'll get subsidized in another way.
Thank the gentleman.
I yield back.
Thank you. Let me recognize a gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell.
With all due respect to my friend through the chair, Mr. Rice, if we follow that path, go down that path, we're not going to have anything. Take my word for it. That's what the big argument we had in the tax reform, quote unquote, of December of 2017. We're going to work together, let's work together. You know how much New Jersey gets back for every dollar it sends down to Washington? Do you know how much North Carolina gets, West Virginia, Louisiana? How can you sit there and say, people got to know what the heck they're paying for? I want to know how come I'm sending all the money to Louisiana. We're one nation. If Eisenhower would have felt that way, we would have had the Interstate Commerce Commission. We wouldn't have the Interstate Highway Commission. And you know it, and I know it. That's absurd, absurd thinking, with all due respect. Many today have rightly focused on the need for improving the national embarrassment that is our D-plus infrastructure. You mentioned that. We've heard about the budgetary gimmicks and shell games as we have failed to make hard choices about the crumbling infrastructure. Congress cannot continue the game. We're suffering the consequences. There are many pressing funding infrastructure projects in the state of New Jersey. We have 229 dams that are high hazard potential. That's over $8.5 billion in drinking water needs. $300 million in unmet needs for our parks. Well, you shouldn't have so much taxes. You should be cutting this. They're all different states, one union. They're all different states. They have different needs. The density of population has a lot to do with what your tax form is. Lower your taxes, then stop complaining. We're double taxed now that you did what you did on the SALT deduction, the oldest deduction in the history of the country. I hope you're proud of it. Failure to build infrastructure programs like Gateway will negatively impact generations of people up and down the eastern seaboard and cost our economy hundreds of millions of dollars. And Mr. Donahue, I understood exactly what you were saying and doing when we had the big fight over the Import-Export Bank. And you know, a lot of Democrats voted for that. A lot of Republicans said, we don't need it. Look at the money that's going to these companies. I remember that battle. The chamber stood up. I'm very proud of the chamber. I hope you'll think about some Democrats down the line who are trying to do the job, as well as the other side, in all due respect.
You may have noticed that we've made some changes in the way we're calculating our support.
Yes. We had no shortage of bipartisan solutions. You know, the ARC Tunnel is something that's right before us. It affects millions and millions and millions of people. In previous Congresses, I offered a proposal to raise the gas tax and, of course, indexing of the gas tax with former member of this committee, Congressman Joe Renacci, and he was no wild lefty, I can assure you. It was never acted on. You don't want to touch it. It's like a hot wire. You don't even want to talk about it. Now we have Gateway and the Portal Bridge projects that receive bipartisan and regional support. The issue is the president, our president, I might add, holding up one of the most important infrastructure projects in the nation for no reason other than the petty spite we have come to associate with this president. How else do you explain it? Give me some algebra or geometry to explain it. Infrastructure investment has a higher return on investment than almost anything Congress can do. It has direct bearing on the daily lives of most Americans. Every dollar of infrastructure investment creates more than $3 in economic growth. And I wanted to ask you, Mr. Trumka, can you talk about why making the infrastructure package a reality is so important to the labor community? Why is that so important?
It's important for a number of reasons. One, it creates jobs. It's a massive job creator. Two, it is a good paying job. Those are good paying jobs, construction jobs, so it helps contribute to the economy. Three, those jobs offer a pathway out of the communities for disadvantaged people of color. It offers them a pathway out and a career for life, quite frankly, having a trade. All of those makes our lives a whole lot easier because we put too many hours on the job already, and adding another 97 hours stuck in traffic and not being with our family, not coaching Little League, not going to church, not doing a number of things, makes the quality of every American's life less than what it should be, could be, and will be when we correct this problem.
Thank you, and thanks to the panel. Excellent panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Lady.
The chair recognizes Mr. Schweikert from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You look good in that seat.
Majority has its privileges.
Hey, this is one of those, look, I love this subject because I see it a bit as a puzzle, but let me share with the panel and my fellow members, I see it as a financing issue, a technology, and then we're going to have to deal with permitting, litigation, those sorts of things. First on the financing, and Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to actually just submit for the record, it's something from the Center for Capital Markets about the amounts of insurance capital that would be available, and part of with no objection.
Without objection.
And one of the reasons for putting that in the record is we have, on occasion, we'll hear, or do we need an infrastructure bank or those things? Capital isn't our problem. It's silos to pay it back. It's what is the mechanism to pay it back. There seems to be plenty of capital floating around our society and the world right now for infrastructure. It's what's your channel for paying it back. Mr. Donahue, you actually touched on, and I just wanted to understand it better, that you had a working group that was actually discussing creative ideas.
We went out to a broad range of people, professionals down to students, and said, we're very interested in ideas that would help us look forward in innovative ways on every type of financing you could think about. We've gotten back an unbelievable number of reactions and suggestions. We're sorting through them. We're going to pick the best and give some financial prizes, and then we're going to bring them to this committee and see if you can make something out of them.
Ms. Donahue, can I share my one concern? I ask you to sort of broaden your horizon because financing is one of our mechanisms. Where do we get the revenue to pay, particularly if we use bonded indebtedness or those things? But I will also argue that the technology revolution that's happening, and I know this is sometimes tough for the engineering world, those things, how do you bring technology, engineering, financing, these mechanisms together? Quick thought experiment. What will mass transit look like in an urban area 15 years from now? Will you be waiting for a bus? Will you be waiting for a light rail? Or will you be waiting for the autonomous ride-sharing vehicle to come grab you? I believe it's the latter. In that case, the design of what you finance into will look different. For many of us that care about rural broadband, we're right now launching the mini satellites. The solution for rural broadband is flying up in the sky and being organized right now. The solution's already here. That one's been solved. But we don't seem to catch up in our debates and discussions around here fast enough for how even something as simple as an app like Waze, in its ability to build layers of a smart community, how do we actually make technology part of this infrastructure discussion? Because there is some data out there that a smart city design will have dramatically more impact as a single item in urban traffic than almost anything we actually do. The last one I want to sort of touch base on, and this one's sort of open to the panel. How do we make the efficiency of a permitting process go faster? We in the Maricopa County, which I accept as large urban populated counties, we paid ourselves for the vast majority of our freeway. We missed the gravy train of the interstate highway system. We did it ourselves. We put a half-cent sales tax on ourselves, bonded it up, built, bonded it up, built, and the vast majority of our freeway. But we had one that took 25 years to eventually break ground on because of litigation, environmental, back to litigation, back to another environmental. Anyone here with a brilliant idea on how to shorten that permitting process?
First of all, there are many steps for permitting that are important and necessary. In too many instances, in fact, they do take too long, and we would favor a streamlining of that. I would point to one thing, though. A number of permitting reforms were included in the last Surface Transportation Act bill, the FAST Act, and they have not yet even been implemented.
But they still
would like to see those reforms implemented, and then we're open to join in on other reforms.
And thank you for pointing that out. There's still holes in the litigation side of where different levels of litigation can drag things out. I know I'm down to my last few seconds, but
the gentleman's out of time.
With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I want to commend the chairman for calling this hearing. And I want to thank all of the witnesses who are here. I am excited about so many aspects of what this bill will actually do as we do it. Of course, job creation is one aspect, and I'm seriously excited about that. I'm a strong ally, Mr. Trumka, of labor, and I support project labor agreements on construction activity. But I also serve as chair of the subcommittee on worker and family support. And I'm interested that with any federal investments, that individuals who are often left out of the labor market get an opportunity to participate. That is, foster youth, individuals who've been trained in Job Corps, individuals who have not reached the point where they have union membership or connection to actually get into the union. How do we find ways to bring more of this disadvantaged workforce into the opportunities that would be created?
I gave an expansive answer at the beginning of that with the chairman, but we are doing two other things that I didn't talk about. 68% of our graduates last year were people of color out of our apprenticeship program. But we are going back and doing pre-apprenticeship training to give people the skills necessary to pass our entrance exam and then succeed in our program. That's being highly successful. In addition to that, we have a program called Helmets to Hard Hats. We're going into people coming out of the military, and that's a large percentage of women and people of color and bringing them directly into our apprenticeship programs, giving them the skills that they need to succeed. In addition to that, we retrain every couple of years, and one of the best-kept secrets in America is, other than the military, the United States labor movement trains more people every year than any other entity out there. And the growing number, as I said, a growing number of people of color, people that have been disadvantaged, people that have had the door shut on them. I also want to emphasize just one other point. Minorities and people of color are being forced out of the cities. They're being forced to move further and further and further away from where many of those jobs are located. The transportation system, the transit system that could be created is absolutely essential for them to be able to get to the opportunities that we create, not only with this program, but with every other program out there.
Well, Mr. Donahue, let me ask you, I commend you and the Chamber for the leadership that you have provided and continue to provide on this effort. We used to have something called the Access to Jobs program, reverse commute. As a matter of fact, oftentimes job opportunities are located where people are not. And getting those people to where the jobs are becomes challenging and difficult. The Access to Jobs notion was a program that provided resources, quite frankly, through the transportation bill for individuals to go where the jobs were and to be compensated in the process of doing it. How do you react to that kind of effort in the bill?
We have to do two things at the same time. Number one, there are people still looking for jobs. Many of them are in smaller communities all across this country, about 400 communities, and they're not about to leave, but the jobs have left. And we are working very hard with our companies to try and get individual companies to go to some of those places and set up jobs, because those folks are not going to leave. They've got 5 years left on a mortgage, and Junior and his family lives in the basement, and you know, you go through the whole system, not going, we're going to see if we can get jobs there. But other than that, those kinds of circumstances, we're generally short of people. We have whether you have the lowest unemployment rate in 60-some-odd years. I mean, there are some people not prepared to work, and I give a lot of credit to what Mr. Trump is talking about in his pre-training training to get people up to speed on mathematics and reading and things of that nature, which you absolutely need now to work. So we're looking for people, and we're going to have to do the things we discussed to get opportunities where people are located. What we basically have, we have people without jobs and lots of jobs without people. And it's a challenge for everybody in this room.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank the
Chairman.
gentleman.
Now you're back.
Thank the gentleman. We're going to proceed now to 2 for 1 based on the majority-minority, which is a part of precedent of the committee. So I would recognize Ms. Sanchez, and then we'll go to Ms. Wolarski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. And I'm glad that we've finally had an opportunity to address this urgent issue that should unite Americans across party lines and across demographics. We all know that our infrastructure is crumbling, but I want to emphasize that infrastructure includes more than just massive highway projects. Infrastructure also includes millions of city roads and bridges that our local governments don't have the capacity to rebuild on their own. It even includes maintenance of schools, homes, and other buildings. So there are many pieces to that puzzle, and if any one of those pieces of the puzzle are missing, it grinds our economy and our way of life to a halt. We take for granted public services like energy transmission, flood prevention, safe drinking water, and everything in between. Yet they are all dependent on systems that were built as far back as the 19th century and that desperately needs our investment. So whether you live in an urban, a suburban, or even a rural community, investment in infrastructure is something that will benefit everybody. In my district, for example, one of the most urgent priorities is the repair of the Whittier Narrows Dam, which was built in 1957 and protects more than a dozen cities in Los Angeles County from flooding. Another is a very small bridge that was built in 1965 that connects Los Angeles and Orange counties that is structurally deficient but carries more than 20,000 vehicles a day. There are stories like this in every one of our congressional districts. If the economic benefits alone aren't enough to muster the bipartisan support we need to build a 21st century infrastructure, then we should at least be able to do so, to do a fundamental thing that I think it should be our #1 priority, and that's protecting the health and the lives of our constituents. So, Mr. DiLoretto, I want to start by focusing on the backlog that is facing the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In your testimony, you noted that at the current rate of investment, it would take more than 50 years to repair our nation's dams and levees. As extreme weather conditions and events become more frequent as a result of climate change, how likely is it that we will experience loss of life as a result of that backlog if we don't start doing something immediately?
Well, certainly the risk goes up if we don't start replacing those. Those are high-hazard dams that I'm pretty sure you're talking about. High-hazard dams mean that they have life below the dam, and so those are at risk. And clearly, the longer you wait, the more that the opportunity occurs for an event that will cause those dams to fail. And we haven't been investing enough in those particular projects to allow. We have one in my own neighborhood that we've been working on for 25 years now, kind of the same problem.
And Mr. DiLoretto, I happen to be a card-carrying member of the IBEW. I'm very proud of that. And so I know how much we take our electric grid for granted. California has been a leader in developing renewable energy and improving energy efficiency. What is the federal role in ensuring our electric infrastructure is modernized and able to support the emerging technologies like electric transportation, energy storage, and distributed generation?
Yes, again, thank you for the question. One of the things I will say, and it kind of goes to the other side of your conversation, one of the areas that we have found with the electrical grid is that while the electric companies tend to be privately owned and they tend to have the revenue, they tell us that their issue is the ability to permit projects, and that takes them a long time to compete the electric grid. And so anything that you can do to help them, it's not so much for them money, it's more of regulations for them.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Trumka, I wanted to just give you an opportunity to respond. There was a response to a question by my colleague, Mr. Smith, where a witness alluded to the downsides of increased union workers doing work, and I'd like you to address that if you can. Are there downsides to using union labor? Microphone, please.
There are no downsides. Union labor is the most skilled. One other thing he said was...
And the safest.
Absolutely. He said that in low-density areas, it would increase cost. But what he fails to understand is he doesn't understand the principle of prevailing wage. Because you take the standard that's there, and that's what is required. Not a higher wage, but the standard that already exists. That's to prevent the federal government from using its buying power to drive down wages as opposed to driving them up.
And as I've been on many union construction sites where the safety records are topmost in the industry, I agree that you save costs by using more careful, more safely, more skilled workers. Thank you, and I yield back to the chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. With that, I recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Wolarski, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Brady for holding this hearing. I look forward to working with both of you and the rest of my colleagues to find ways we can enhance our country's infrastructure. Thank you to all of our guests as well. We all know too well that fixing the Highway Trust Fund is a difficult issue, and we've neglected it for too long. The National Association of Manufacturers last week released a report that said we need a reliable, user-based, long-term funding stream so that families, drivers, and manufacturers can have the safe, efficient highways they need. And to that, I absolutely agree. I have one of the largest manufacturing districts in the country. We need to stop using budget gimmicks to keep the trust fund afloat. we need to focus our energies on financing infrastructure projects with a sustainable funding stream while also addressing burdensome regulations and permitting requirements that run up costs and delay projects. So with that, Mr. DiLoretto, the FAST Act included several provisions to improve the condition and performance of the national freight network and to support investment in freight-related surface transportation projects. What's the status of our national freight network, and what's the biggest area of need we need to ensure our national freight network is not hindering the flow of goods?
Well, the biggest concern in freight, and certainly my colleague here on the panel will tell you, is the congestion that each one of those trucks face trying to get to a port to deliver their goods or picking up their goods and taking them back to market. And not only are they sitting in traffic, but so are the people that work at those facilities that are sitting in traffic. So if we looked at that, secondly, we have the issue of the facilities themselves, the bridges and the highways that all of those freight networks have to go over.
Building on that FAST Act, we need to think about how to fund such critical investments in our infrastructure and our economic security. Do you think a freight vehicle miles traveled, the VMT, that flows into priority freight corridors would have the potential to replace the gas tax? Mr. DiLoretto, just still, thanks.
Sorry, my apologies. Well, it certainly could be one of the options. At this point, you know, we're looking at a way to get funds in here to fix these problems today, and those kind of ideas take a number of years to put together.
Mr. Scribner, my colleague Representative Blumenauer and I recently reintroduced the Move America Act, which creates Move America bonds to expand tax-exempt financing for public-private partnerships and Move America credits to leverage additional private equity investments for states. Do you believe allowing states to leverage expanded tax credits and bonds will provide a needed boost in resources to ease the strain on state and local governments?
Yeah, I do think increasing financing options certainly relieves some of the pressure on traditional funding channels.
Do you know of any other funding mechanism that we could build on to help infuse private capital into those infrastructure projects?
Well, as I said in my testimony, I think if we want to see a lot more private sector investment in these public purpose infrastructure projects, the big one to tackle would be eliminating the private activity bond volume cap, which is currently set at $15 billion, and about more than 2/3 of that has been issued or obligated to date.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You'll be back.
I thank the gentlelady. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from New York, a terrific advocate and really presents compelling arguments as it relates to infrastructure, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The issue of infrastructure in terms of the bricks and mortar, there is no dispute. There's universal and acceptance of the urgency to invest in American infrastructure. You know, the user fee model is predicated on that it's an activity that should be paid for by the users of the activity, providing there's no larger benefit. And I'll give you a couple of examples. And I just think that we're stuck on this user fee idea, or as Mr. Donahue said, no cash, no dash. We have paid $240 billion rebuilding the roads and bridges of Iraq and Afghanistan. This was all deficit financed, and we were told that there would be a user fee imposed on the revenues of Iraqi oil that never materialized. So American taxpayers are stuck with that bill. No return on investment. The U.S. corporate tax cut of $1.5 trillion over a 10-year period will never recapture the economic growth. Everybody's analysis who matters has concluded that. Best case scenario, for every dollar that you give away in a corporate tax cut, you get about 32 cents back in economic activity. That's a 68% loss on investment. Infrastructure is different. Infrastructure is different. Mr. Trumka, in his opening comment, talked about a 3-to-1 ratio, growth to cost ratio. So that is, for every dollar that you invest in infrastructure, you get $3 back in economic growth, all right? So if you were to spend $1 trillion over 5 years, that would result in $200 billion in each of the 5 years. $200 billion in a $20 trillion economy represents 1% economic growth. You add the multiplier effect of another $400 billion, you're at 3% economic growth for infrastructure alone. And when that 3% economic growth for each year over the next 5 years based on an infrastructure investment, on top of what economists forecast growth to be about 2.5%, you're in the 5% range. The last time the American economy had that kind of sustained economic growth, we did not have budgetary deficits. We had a budgetary surplus. And we had a lot of money to invest in education, scientific research, and the other things that we view are important. Most economists believe that the greatest return on investment is infrastructure. We create good jobs. We make the economy function that much more efficiently. And it seems to me that we shouldn't be stuck on the user fee. We should have had a user fee for the corporate tax cut because that didn't pay for itself. This does. So however way we do it, and look, I know there'll be a pay for in some way, but I just think that we need to focus on the growth that would occur and the growth that has been deferred for the past 20 years, when in fact we're investing hundreds of billions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan to reconstruct roads and bridges, and not here in America. Mr. Trumka.
Well, your analysis also didn't add in the savings of roughly $2,000 a year for traveling that would be spent on other things, and that would also spur the economy even more. We are at a crisis here. $200 billion a year for 5 years, that's about half of where it needs to actually be. Because we think it takes $2 trillion over 10 years to get us up to good working order, and then another $2 trillion almost over that same 10 years to get us into the 21st century, where we have a grid that is more dependable and actually more efficient and saves money in transmission to do a number of other things. We also, I know you're very, very interested in the use of technology, and we are undergoing, we, the labor movement, are undergoing a futures project right now to determine where the economy is going and where work is going, and how we plug in artificial intelligence, robotics, and other types of technology, how that will affect us, how that will affect the economy, and how that will affect actually the American society.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm so excited today that we're finally talking about a subject that I think actually will unite, it should unite Republicans and Democrats because of the urgent need we have in fixing our infrastructures across the board. Whether you live in rural Alabama or you live in urban New York, infrastructure affects everybody's everyday life. I'd actually like to point to a problem that I'm experiencing in my local rural communities, and that's the issue, really a public health crisis in water and sewer infrastructure. This is basic infrastructure. And in America in 2019, there are parts of my district, Lowndes County, Alabama, for one, Perry County, Alabama, where some of my constituents live in remote locations that are not connected to the water and sewer lines of the county or the city. So it's decentralized areas where sometimes people inherit land and put trailers on those lands and create little small enclaves on that land. And they're using septic tanks if they can afford it. Some are using straight pipe. And we all know that with straight pipe, there's a problem of the waste leaving their domicile, but going outside and puddling in the soil, sometimes flowing into the local streams, and it's a serious public health crisis. And I noticed that in your testimony, Mr. De Laredo, you actually spoke about that, and I'd like for you to espouse upon the real public health costs that are associated with our crumbling infrastructure when it comes to water and sewer.
Right, well, thank you very much for the question. I actually got a call, I think it might have been from your area or Louisiana, where they had a water crisis because the people in that rural area couldn't drink water. And guess what they have to do? They have to go buy bottled water, which is anywhere from 5 to 10 times the price of if we would put in a public water system for those folks. I know that we have worked, when I say we, in my area in Oregon, we've worked with some rural counties, and the Department of Agriculture has had some programs that we were able to tap into to help those small rural areas develop some public water system. But clearly, it's a public health issue, and we owe more to our life expectancy in this country to save drinking water and wastewater than to any medical procedure that ever came along.
Absolutely. And I also noticed in your testimony, you talked a little bit about the importance of public-private partnerships. In particular, I was a bond lawyer before I was a member of Congress, and I have to tell you, making sure that we do what we can on this committee to promote advanced refundings, to lift the cap or eliminate the cap on private activity bonds, all of those are ways that we can actually help spur better public-private partnerships and money in there. Would you talk a little bit about the importance of really investing across the board in municipal financing and helping with the infrastructure, crumbling infrastructure that we're seeing?
Right. Well, and certainly as someone who's a city engineer, I took advantage of the municipal bond market many times. And the fact is, any of those costs that we incur building infrastructure gets passed on to the people that use them, and particularly in water and wastewater. So the cheaper we make those costs is the cheaper that they're going to be able to afford those water and wastewater projects. It's just that simple.
Mr. Spears, would you like to add to that? Because you talked about Build America Fund, which is very similar to Build America Bonds and other things that will really help to spur that.
Well, I think we're supporting 71% of the domestic freight in the country. So in terms of the supply chain, it's very instrumental. And this kind of speaks to Mr. Rice's question earlier about how interconnected infrastructure, modes, states, congressional districts really are. If you look at the heat maps that I put in my testimony, you get a really good example of how even the most rural, poorest communities are served by states 600 to 1,000 miles away within 3 to 5 days. So our industry is very vital for gluing that together and making certain that even the most rural, poorest communities are getting, cost-contained goods and products as quickly as you can. So,
Mr. Scribner, you talked about private activity bonds in particular. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I know that two-thirds of the $15 billion have already been allocated, and God knows that they never make their way to rural parts of this nation. But could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think, this allows more sort of alternative construction management financing options. It brings more to the table than you can do with just traditional funding. And ultimately, really what I want to see, and I'm sure many here do as well, but shifting the risk away from taxpayers, both construction and financing risk, and on to investors. I think that's a major benefit to these types of programs that you can't get through traditional
Mr.
funding.
Chair, I just really wanted to say it's about thinking holistically, so it's being comprehensive in how we go about funding our crumbling infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentlelady, and let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, to inquire.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing today. I want to thank all the witnesses for your valuable testimony here today. And my district in central Illinois is kind of a poster child for infrastructure: roads, bridges, rail, locks and dams on the Illinois and Mississippi rivers, and transit. And you can't drive down a road or go across a bridge or navigate your way down the Illinois River without seeing the need for infrastructure. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, of 10 infrastructure categories, 7 are in mediocre condition and 3 are in poor condition. And my constituents and people all across this country deserve better. And we've heard a lot today from both sides on the need to upgrade our infrastructure. But of course, how do you pay for it? And that's the big issue that we have to deal with. And I think any reasonable person knows that it's going to take a multifaceted approach with the support from local, state, and federal governments, along with the private industry, and partnerships between all of these entities to get it right. And I want to bring attention to one of those partnerships in particular. It's between the insurance industry and those looking to finance infrastructure projects. Not only do I have a heavy ag and manufacturing presence in my district, but I also enjoy representing large insurance companies, State Farm Insurance, Allstate, Country Financial, and Carthage Mutual Insurance Company. The numbers are staggering. Of the $5.8 trillion in investment assets held by insurers, $986 billion are held in municipal securities that are issued to fund our roads, schools, and hospitals. Insurers also directly invest in infrastructure projects, having provided $26 billion, or 6% of all private infrastructure investment in 2016. Insurance companies' investments in these types of bonds create additional demand for these types of financial products, which in turn lowers the borrowing costs for cities, counties, and states to fund highways, schools, and sewer systems. This ends up being a win-win for everyone. Mr. Donahue, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce released a paper just yesterday titled The Role of Insurance Investments in the U.S. Economy. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit that for the record here today. And, Mr. Donahue, thank you. Mr. Donahue, would you mind providing to the committee a high-level overview of this report and its conclusions?
I'll be very happy to see that such a summary comes very quickly. But to tell you, just in one sentence, when we put together the equation on how we're going to do this, investment by domestic and international insurance companies will be part of the solution.
Thank you. I was wondering if anybody else would care to comment on the role of potential insurance investments would play.
Thank you. The only comment that I would make is if you look at the report that we've done at ASC, we consider all options open, and they do have a great amount of capital that can be brought to bear. Again, at the same time, though, they expect to earn some money and be repaid for that investment. So it's another tool, and as you start to look at this entire equation, you've got to look at all of these and include them.
Thank you. Those are all my questions, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and with that, let me recognize the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Del Bene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding today's hearing on such an important topic, and thanks to all our witnesses for being here. Excuse me, I have the privilege of representing a very diverse district that has both urban and rural areas. Due to the makeup of my district, a very unique set of issues needs to be addressed when we talk about infrastructure. And in addition to ensuring the sustainability and safety of our bridges, roads, waterways, and dams, I'm happy that we're here today discussing how to invest additional money into our crumbling infrastructure, but I'd like to highlight one area that is often left behind, and that's broadband, and in particular, rural broadband. It's estimated that 32 million Americans lack access to robust broadband. This is completely unacceptable in a world where the internet is a key driver of economic growth and innovation in all sectors. Rural America is being shut out of emerging opportunities for prosperity and growth created in our modern economy. And in my state alone, there are nearly 366,000 people, my state, which is a technology state, nearly 366,000 people without what the FCC deems as adequate internet service. And you know, this has an impact on our transportation infrastructure as well. Some of you were talking about the cost that we're all paying for infrastructure, whether it's fixing your car when it hit a pothole or the cost of being in traffic. But there's also a cost of not having adequate broadband. That means people have to make trips they otherwise wouldn't have to take. It means lost opportunities where there's not economic opportunity because a business can't move into an area because the infrastructure isn't there. Mr. DiLoretto, I see in your report that you've given the nation's electricity and transmission lines a D grade. I believe many in my district would also describe access to broadband as receiving an F grade. But in order to solve that rural broadband problem, first we need a complete and accurate picture of the problem. And unfortunately, the National Broadband Map hasn't been thoroughly updated in years. And we can't really solve a problem if we don't have the data and understand the size of that problem. So first, Mr. DiLoretto, would you be supportive of allocating infrastructure funds to updating and maintaining the broadband map? And do you agree that this is an urgent problem?
I'm not sure I can speak one way or the other. We don't include broadband in our report because typically civil engineers aren't doing broadband, and so our experts that do the report tend to be experts in those 16 categories. So I'm probably not the best person to ask.
No, that's fair. Mr. Donahue, what do you feel about rural broadband, given there's so many missed economic opportunities there?
We have a responsibility to work to put adequate coverage in the rural areas for broadband, whether it belongs in infrastructure spending of this type or it comes out of requirements on the other industries that are very involved in this, which some exist now, is a matter that's going to have to be discussed. I'm very sensitive from an education point of view and from a medical point of view to this expansion of broadband, and would be happy because we cover all these other subjects to participate in those discussions. I just wouldn't want to say right now, this is the place that those funds should come from.
I think rural broadband is basic foundational infrastructure for every sector of our economy. And so, Mr. Trumka, what do you feel about the investment in rural broadband and where we should make, or should we make it a priority, and where should those resources come from?
I think absolutely we need to make it a priority. I come from a rural area, and I know what happens. Experts are now warning of the broadband gap in which rural and low-income communities suffer from a lack of infrastructure to deliver reliable, fast internet, referred to as broadband. So we would welcome that opportunity. And I would just, if you wouldn't mind, just add one other thing. We've talked about infrastructure, but one of the infrastructures we didn't talk about today, and I think needs to be mentioned, is our crumbling school systems. The physical plants of our schools are deteriorating. In Congressman Evans' district, children are going to school without heat, without air conditioning, asbestos, lead paint, and a number of things. We need to focus on that. And generally, it's rural schools who fall behind because of the way those systems are funded.
No, thank you for adding that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. And with that, let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, to inquire.
Thank you. I'd like to draw the committee's attention to the need for investment in our freight rail network, and I'd like to address this to Mr. DiLoretto. My district in Southern California sits near the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. 40% of the imports that come from those ports go to the rest of the nation, and 25% of the nation's exports go back out to other countries through those ports. Most of those products then go through freight rail lines through my district in the San Gabriel Valley, one of the most congested areas in the nation. Unless fixed, there are excess emissions, train horn noise, and the potential for collisions. And by 2040, there is expected a dramatic increase. The ports are projected to handle about 35 million units of cargo, which will generate close to 120,000 truck trips per day. That's nearly double the current levels. Of course, we have some that are working on this. The Alameda Corridor East Project, or ACE, is responsible for constructing grade separations to facilitate the movement of all these freight trains through this urban area. They've constructed 19 grade separations, and more than $1.6 billion has been raised by them from regional, state, federal railroad programs and other sources. However, the federal contribution stands at less than 15%, despite the national significance of this goods movement through this corridor. So, Mr. DiLoretto, can you discuss the importance of maintaining and improving freight rail corridors, especially those near our nation's major ports? Is this need expected to grow, and how can the federal government further invest not only directly in freight rail, but also projects like ACE that support the national freight network?
Yes, thank you. Well, in our report card, good news of all the 16 categories was freight did receive the highest grade, grade of B. And those were experts in the freight rail industry that sit on the report card, look at the data that's out there, and analyze it and get a grade. I mean, we have 5 million tons of freight delivering approximately 85,000 passengers also a day. And the freight rail owns the vast majority of it. But they spent $27 billion in 1 year in freight rail improvements. Now, I can't talk about where they made those improvements, but all over the nation. Between our 2013 and 2017, they spent $20 billion a year on freight rail improvements. The fact is, out of our 16 categories, they're the one category that spent a lot of money on freight rail. And you're absolutely right. Getting goods to the ports so they can go overseas or wherever they're going or coming back into service is critical to the economy of this nation.
Thank you for that. Mr. Trumka and Mr. Donahue, in my Los Angeles district in Southern California, we have overwhelming gridlock, pollution, and congestion, and that's why we're so excited about expanding our public transit system. While we might be famous for our freeways, we're excited to see the expansion of something called the Light Rail Gold Line, which connects the San Gabriel Valley to downtown Los Angeles and other segments as well. The last segment of the Gold Line added 19 segments to the rail line from Pasadena to Azusa. But what's even more exciting is the greater economic development it spurred. More than 8,500 housing units, more than 2.4 million square feet of commercial development, private sector investment of over $4.7 billion. So, Mr. Trumka and Donahue, can you talk about the implications for job creation and business development when you have these kinds of projects?
It's almost infinite, and it also opens up opportunities. As I said earlier, people that have been disadvantaged and denied those opportunities are forced to live further out of the city. And in order to get there, they need the transportation system. But that happens every single place where we do it. Businesses grow up, housing grows up, economic activity flourishes when you have the ability to get to and from your home and work. So we're very much in favor of improving the entire rail system, but light rail and transit as well.
Mr. Donahue?
First of all, I served on one of the major railroad boards for 22 years, and the answer about the investments by the privately owned railroads get up around $20 billion a year, and you multiply that for a long period of time, and that's why we have the systems we have. The reality that you face in that circumstance is those systems are surrounded by roads and off-ramps and so on, as you articulated, that were not at the same time improved by government. And we need to look at that. In terms of other rail projects, I'm a realist, and when they bring those projects, we'll look at them.
Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. I'm reminded that Mr. Trumka and Mr. Donahue, they have a meeting coming up in the near future, and if the committee could proceed on that basis, it would be noted. The gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, is recognized to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. You know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has gotten our economy growing at historic levels. I think we all agree that infrastructure is the key to our future. And in order to support our economy, our education, our national security, and in general, our quality of life. That's why I'm glad we're here today to be able to talk about how we can continue to grow the economy and rebuild the country instead of focusing on hearings and investigations that may not help us move forward. As a representative from Kansas, I'm proud to know that our country continues to benefit from the leadership of President Eisenhower for our massive highway system. And as we meet today, looking at ways that we can work together to provide that same leadership for the next generation of Americans. You know, in the 63 years since President Eisenhower established the interstate highway system, we've made a lot of progress connecting our country throughout roads and infrastructure that wasn't even imagined 6 decades ago. However, as the country and economies evolved, we must do more to cut the government red tape and streamline the processes to build new infrastructure at a faster and more cost-effective rate. As I mentioned, I believe infrastructure is a key to our economic growth. Perfect example of this, the problem that we have in our country is in the North Junction in Wichita, right in my district, where Interstate 235, Interstate 135, Kansas Highway 254, and Kansas Highway 96 meet. Currently, there's 96,000 vehicles that travel across that annually, including 9,400 trucks, and use that on a daily basis. And by 2050, the Kansas Department of Transportation expects that to nearly double to over 160,000 vehicles per day. Concept has been produced, but we need to actually start construction. We need to move forward with that project. Wichita being the air capital of the world, a major manufacturer of goods, as well as a producer of agriculture products in the area, we need to make sure that projects like the North Junction work to help not only our city, but also the country. It's also important that we emphasize and recognize that infrastructure doesn't just include roads and bridges. It includes things like water treatment plants, airports, waterways, and broadband, which are vital to so many areas across not just my state, but also our country. As we look for these new solutions, we need to make sure that traditional sources of revenue for infrastructure like the gas tax should be treated as user fees, meaning that the money collected through the gas tax and set aside for the Highway Trust Fund should be used as it's intended and focused on improving roads and other transportation needs. We know that the Highway Transportation Funds, the needs have surpassed the receipts since 2008, leading us to have to use some general funds to help maintain that process. So we need to make sure that as we address this go forward, that we've got a leaky bucket. We need to make sure that we focus on how do we improve the surface transportation, make sure money's used there. I want to make sure I've got a little time for questions. One of the things I mentioned about the Highway Trust Fund, and Mr. Scribner, maybe you can address this, is that while I believe the trust fund should be used as a user fee, I mean, currently we talked about before, 20% of it's being siphoned off for non-highway projects. Do you believe there's money should be used for highway transportation as it was originally intended?
Yes, I think and we've seen it occur over time, beginning in the 1970s, but the gradual mission creep in the Highway Trust Fund to fund all sorts of things, some which have nothing to do with transportation. We've seen transportation museums get funding in the past. But I think, yes, that money should be repurposed and focus on core highway assets because it's the users of those assets that are paying and where that revenue is coming from.
One of the other things we've talked about is how do we identify projects of national importance? I mean, do you have some thoughts on how we would do that?
Well, I think the focus should be on moving freight, and that's why I said in my testimony that I don't think mass transit anywhere should be considered a nationally significant project. That isn't to say that the New York City subway system or transit systems, especially in the 6 legacy transit cities, aren't important. They are, but those are local issues, and I think it's important to refocus the federal issues on issues that are truly national.
All right, thank you. I'm about out of time. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byard, to inquire.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for doing this, and it's fun to be part of this first one in 8 years. I want to state just 2 statements. First of all, I really want to push back on Mr. Scribner's testimony about the way he characterized spending on mass transit. I think he says mass transit is 28% of that federal highway spending, 5 times what the commuter mode would share, 11 times what it would be with non-commuter and freight. But what's neglected is how many roads and highways are replaced by mass transit. For example, Virginia Railway Express, which runs from Fredericksburg to Washington, D.C., replaces 1 full lane on I-95. I think it does the same on I-66 coming in from Manassas. And that if you somehow, when we have just 1 metro line down, the entire city stops. Because you just can't move the trucks or the commuters or anybody else without mass transit. And in fact, if you were to take all the money we put into Metro and try to put it into roads and bridges, there's nowhere to put it. I mean, it just doesn't happen. Which also recognizes that cities like Washington, New York, major cities all across the country that enjoy transit are also not discrete economic units. I mean, what would New York City be without the subway? But those aren't just people that live in New York City. That's the economic engine for the region, the country, the world. And so I think we need to look at this in a really integrated fashion. The second thing I'd like to just expand on is my friend Tom Reed from New York talked about should we consider general revenue measures? And there seemed to be unanimity that we shouldn't decouple user fees from user benefits. So I'd like to argue that we need to think much larger, that we live, again, not in discrete economic units, that some old man who lives in Old Town Alexandria who only walks his dog is nevertheless benefiting from all the freight that comes in by air and by trucks, by the ability of that whole transportation system, including broadband and sewers and water systems, that this national infrastructure that we're talking about is not just about getting people to work. It's about making our entire society, our entire economy work. So I hope that we don't cling to this fake linkage between user benefit and user fee, because we really need to think decoupling. And we may need to, because 25 cents sounds pretty good, but that's $340 billion, and we're talking $2 trillion just to get up to a B measure. Let me actually move to a question, though, in the time I have left. Nearly every time it rains in Old Town, we have combined sewer overflow. And we had 11 million gallons last year. We had 61 inches of rain, which is an all-time high since we began measuring it. So, Mr. DiLoretto, I think there are 800 cities nationwide with this problem, including Washington, D.C., which is dumping into the same Potomac River. Shouldn't CSO, combined sewer overflow, be something we also focus on as we look at infrastructure renewal?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, it is included in our numbers, this combined sewers that we've have to. And most major cities in the United States, back in the day, that's how you treated it. Dilution was a solution to pollution, you know, and so we combined them all. We've since determined that's not the way we ought to be discharging our effluent. So absolutely, it's a part of it. It's a part of showing where we have a gap in terms of wastewater and water. We only have a third of the revenue that we're going to need to meet our wastewater and water infrastructure needs by 2025.
Thank you. Mr. DiLoretto, since you are our resident senior engineer, climate change, we have many hearings up here about more and more extreme weather events, greater existing toll or infrastructure. I won't go through all of the hurricanes and floods and droughts, but does your ASCA work anticipate ever more extreme climate and how we have to prepare for these unpredictable moments in our infrastructure planning?
Yeah, absolutely. And our organization is responsible for a number of standard publications that engineers use in designing structures, and we continually are updating those. So work we did on stormwater 15, 20 years ago where our tables showed this was the expectation, those tables look totally different today based on new models that we're undertaking. Our solution to infrastructure funding includes sustainability and reliability. That's one of the pillars of the 3 points.
Thank you. Mr. Trumka, you talked so eloquently about the working men and women of America. To be productive and successful, they not only have to get to work, but also have stable, reliable homes that are a reasonable distance from work. And every major metropolitan area has a shortfall of affordable and available homes. I think it's 150,000 housing units just in Metro Washington, D.C. Wouldn't you agree that affordable housing should also be something we're thinking about as we think about renewing our infrastructure?
I would say yes. We personally in the labor movement have a fund, a $6 billion fund, where we're trying to do housing, particularly in rural areas and low-income areas. But if you can't bring people in, or if you can bring people in closer, there's less congestion, less traffic. If you can get them in really close, then you have even more benefit from it. So it is an expanded definition of infrastructure.
So as you know, we're going to have votes on the House floor, so if we could proceed to make sure we get as many questions as so we will not inconvenience the witnesses, that would be helpful. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, is recognized to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, I thank you for your leadership for having this hearing. I want to piggyback on something Mr. Trumka raised. I just want to start out with a report. In 2006, the Building Education Success Together report, it was found that high poverty and minority
Could you push your mic? Thank you.
In 2006, there was a report found that high poverty and minority serving schools are unable to adequately invest in school facilities. It was also found that schools predominantly serving white students nearly spent 50% more on capital construction, and that those serving minority students and wealthy spend triply less in terms of that. That came out on the GAA report. During this hearing, we have heard a lot about roads and bridges. And while those are vital concerns across our country, I think that first and foremost, we need to address the infrastructure regarding our public schools. So I want to raise that and piggyback directly to Mr. Trumka and then to Mr. Donovan, because he's president of the chamber, exactly what is happening in terms of our schools, and we're not talking about our school facilities. So I start out with Mr. Trumka.
Two things are happening. Since the recession, the states have spent less and less on our schools. The system, the physical plant of a lot of our schools, particularly in low-income and poor areas, is crumbling. And it's debilitating to the educational system. When a child is sitting in a room and has to wear a coat and a hat and scarf and gloves, they're not paying attention to learning, they're paying attention to staying warm. And so doing the physical plant, raising the wages of teachers to attract the best and the brightest is what we need to do. And our system is failing right now. There is a bill right now in front of the House. It's H.R. 865, the Rebuild America School Act of 2019, which would pump significant amounts of money into our public school system and into the physical plant so that a kid in rural Mississippi or rural Pennsylvania or downtown Philadelphia can go to a school and have an environment that's conducive to learning, not conducive to just surviving.
Mr. Donovan, I'd like for you to speak to the issue, because one of my colleagues raised the question about if you want to beat China. What I heard my colleague say from Wisconsin talked about the infrastructure. From a chamber perspective, you want to speak to that issue, this issue?
I have three things to say. First of all, we need to compete with China. We're trying to do it on the trade issue. We need to do it on the national security issue and the intelligence issue. And that's going to come out of a lot of committees of the Congress of the United States. The second thing is everybody wants to improve our schools. I'm just talking about facilities right now. And that is a local responsibility and a national responsibility where local cannot adequately handle that. And I think that's something that should be considered by the Congress of the United States. I'm not sure that I want to put that into infrastructure, my third point, because at the rate we're discussing infrastructure, we're going to have, you know, half of the federal budget of the United States being considered under the infrastructure need, and we all know we can't do that. Besides which, I think if you deal with the committees on both the appropriation and the substance side, you get a lot more expertise, and I hope the chairman makes sure that the points that have been raised here gets to the right people.
Real quick, as you know, and you and I have been around for a little while, even Richard Nixon talked about building school buildings in a debate with John F. Kennedy. So it's rather interesting. Here we are in 2019 and 21st century in terms of trying to be competitive. We're still kind of hesitant. If you go back to that debate, you'll see specifically that even Nixon spoke about school facilities. So I don't have 23 seconds for the chairman. You want to give any response to that?
But other than saying that Nixon lost, but
okay.
To Kennedy, listen, what we need to do is face up to the reality that a lot of schools have to be fixed, and we have to do it the right way. There is a debate from where we do that, but I think you should keep right on pushing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses. I think we have a witness that has a comment.
Mr. Chairman, yes. You know, we have to go to the White House, and I would like to be excused.
So you mean you'd give up time with the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee to go to the White House?
No. I fully understand, but the allocation of resources will be much more significant here for a longer period of time than will be the debate that will take place in the White House. And by the way, just to let you know, it is the new committee that are dealing with jobs and the related issues to that are a great concern to your committee.
If I get the same choice, I would opt to stay with this committee, by the way.
Could you take questions from Mr. Arrington? That'll be and then we'll go over to
Mr. Donahue, I know you've got to run, so I'll just jump right in it. First, let me just ask that you
we're going to come back, though.
Plead to this president, who I know has a heart for the forgotten man, not just in the Rust Belt, in the manufacturing sector of our economy, but also our farmers and ranchers in the ag sector. And I represent 29 rural counties in West Texas, and I'd like for you to just remind everybody involved in infrastructure that if we don't have sustainable communities, we won't have vibrant ag and energy. If we don't have vibrant ag and energy, we will not have the energy dominance and independence that is of national security import. Neither will we have food security, which is of equal national security import. So my responsibility representing rural America is to ensure that they are a priority because, as you know, they don't have the tax base, they don't have the people. As somebody once said, there are more plows, sows, and cows than people in rural America, but the product is precious. And we need to make sure we have a system that can efficiently move that product to feed and clothe the American people and also to export markets. Talk about, do you believe that's important, and are we talking at the table with the players to ensure that that will be a priority, whatever direction and whatever amount of monies we decide to spend on this?
I've been very involved in the food issues for a long time, very involved in the transportation issues, which are fundamental to the delivery of agricultural products for export and for consumption, and will continue to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Donahue. Please make your way to the White House if you need to. You won't offend me. I've got a little under 3 minutes left. Let me connect West Texas to the rest of the country by saying we're at the base of the ports to plains transportation corridor. That is from the largest inland port of Laredo, Texas, up through my district, Lubbock, Texas, and Mac Thornberry's district, Amarillo, all the way to the Canadian border, representing 2,300 miles of transportation infrastructure. It's only 5% of the nation's roads, yet it carries over 55% of the vehicle miles traveled. Again, the backbone, the heartland, and distributing that important product efficiently and safely. Do any of the other panelists have a comment about making sure that corridors like the one I described in Middle America and the product that it's carrying to market should be prioritized, and how we prioritize it?
I just would point to Texas and how this committee really looks at an infrastructure bill, but also trade policy. And Texas is a really good example of that. Trucks move 76% of the NAFTA surface freight. I've been to Laredo, 14,000 trucks crossing that border every day. And the amount of pressure that puts on our infrastructure to serve the other states that neighbor Texas and beyond is quite significant. So when you're looking at trade policy, infrastructure policy, they really are very much interconnected. And how all the modes feed off of that is really critical. So we've grown over the last few years to the point where our nation's economy depends on policies that, quite frankly, cross several issues within this committee's jurisdiction. So I would really encourage you to look creatively at that when you look at both issues.
That was very eloquent and succinct. But let me shift now to a different issue for Mr. Scribner. Obviously, we've got to be smarter. You've mentioned that in your testimony about how we spend. And my question is, how would you prioritize what is the national important priority. How would you go about that? Because we can't fix everything. We can't modernize every component of the infrastructure system. So how do we determine what is a national priority? And then how do we distinguish between the federal, state, and local so we make the dollar go the furthest, not to mention all the other improvements we could make on the regulatory front, please?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the interstate highway system should be the priority in all of this, and I think we should, within that, we should prioritize based on freight movements. I think freight is really, that is where you have the federal nexus, or at least the strongest federal nexus, and where I believe the focus should be. I would point out that Texas last year became the only net donor state under the Highway Trust Fund since the bailouts began of 2008. So, you know, we don't have the dynamic that we had pre-bailout, but right now we have Texas sending more money to Washington than they're receiving out of the federal programs, and that should obviously be examined.
Sorry for exceeding my time, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
gentlemen. With that, we'll have Mr. Snyder inquire, then the chair will recess, and we'll come back immediately after the third vote.
Thank you, and I want to again thank the chairman and the ranking member for having this critically important hearing and the witnesses for staying and sharing your perspectives. Mr. Spears, you touched on these are issues. Infrastructure is big, it is complex, and it is interconnected with literally everything we do in this country economically. In my district, the suburbs of North Chicago, infrastructure is a top-of-mind everyday issue. For roads, a recent report estimated that people in Chicago spend 130 hours a year in congestion, in traffic, unproductive time that's a loss to the economy. On rail, Metra has 840 bridges, 400 of which are more than 100 years old. It's not a current modern infrastructure. On freight, Chicago is the intersection of the country, and we see that on rails, roads. It is a real congestion point. And in the communities in my district, every time it rains, we face flooding. Impact of the flood waters from the skies can overwhelm our sewer systems, but then river flooding coming from the north can overwhelm communities a second time in just a couple of days. It's a major problem. So infrastructure is crucial not just to our future, but also to our present. And it's projected, as others have said, that $3 is returned for every dollar invested in infrastructure. I can make the argument in some aspects it's even greater than that. But as my colleague from Texas mentioned, we can't do everything all at once. If we try to do it all at once, it's a recipe for failure. But if we set priorities and develop a smart strategy, then we can begin to do, and as a nation, I don't think there's any challenge we can't overcome. We need to strategically prioritize our investments and close the gap to build what Mr. Trump has said was the modern, forward-looking infrastructure that's designed to be transformative, to be resilient, and to be flexible for the future. We need to address the population growth and distribution changes within our nation and our local communities. We have to be prepared to address climate change, the impacts of more frequent, more intense storms, and anticipating new technologies and where communities are moving. So in the context of priorities, I guess, Mr. DiLoretto, I'll start with you as a fellow engineer, but I'll ask you for the whole panel, what are the most urgent things we should be focusing on? Mr. Scribner, you said traffic, but I'm asking, what are the things we have to address now? Because if we fail to address them, the costs are going to be catastrophic down the road. What are priorities that would give us the highest return to put $1 in today to get more dollars back more quickly so we can invest in new projects? And what would be the most transformative?
Well, let me answer your question in this way. One of the things we have not done in our report is advocate for a particular infrastructure category being more important than the other. And the reason I tell you that is because all 16 of them are connected. Right. So, for example, we could have the best highway system in our country, and when those trucks get to the ports, they're stuck. They can't go anywhere. We could fix our dams, but the levees don't work. So what we do is we need a plan, but we need a plan, unfortunately, for all 16 categories because they're so interconnected with one another. You can do a great electric or a great wastewater system, but they're the highest users of electricity. And if the electric grid goes down, that sewage is sitting there at the treatment plant waiting to go somewhere.
So I know we have to walk and chew gum at the same time, but again, if we try to do it all at once, we get nowhere. We have to take steps.
Right, but I think in each category.
Mr. Spear.
Yeah, in my testimony, I wanted to point to page 5, which really I think captures, from a roads and bridges perspective, just 17% of the national highway system miles represents 87% of total truck congestion costs nationwide. So there you have 17%. There's your priority focal point. And in the FAST Act that came out does have a national freight program. Our proposal as a Build America Fund really builds upon that as well by having a national priorities program. So a certain percentage would go to that 17%, and the remaining amounts would go to local priority programs. We're not dismissing the importance of rural and the connectivity that is really critical. So really looking at the priorities, you can look at congestion and really narrow down where you've got to focus your dollars.
Thank you. Mr. Scribner?
Yeah, I agree with what Mr. Spears said in terms of targeting resources. Several reports have come out identifying specific, say, widening projects that need to be undertaken due to population growth and truck congestion. So, and looking into things like truck-only lanes and certain very congested truck corridors. But absolutely, there are ways we can target this.
Great, thank you. And with my last seconds, I'd just like to make one pitch to Mr. DiLoretto, although it's not in your bailiwick as civil engineers. Rural broadband is critical to our rural communities. Infrastructure, by definition, is enabling. It enables our communities. It's what's enabled our economy to be the global leader in the world. Rural broadband has to be a part of that for our rural communities. And I yield back.
We'll ask the witnesses to stay. We'll be right back, I think probably 10 or 15 minutes.
I've been waiting so long to do that. I was like, where did he put the letter? Without looking all like weird about it, I was like, where did he put
Testing.